A billionaire faked his own terminal illness to see who really loved him. Marcus Wellington had everything money could buy, but he suspected the people closest to him only cared about his fortune. So he hatched the most dangerous plan of his life: convince everyone he was dying to discover their true hearts. What started as a simple test turned into a shocking revelation that would expose gold diggers, reveal unexpected heroes, and uncover family betrayals that ran deeper than he ever imagined. His fake illness became real drama when lawyers appeared with suspicious documents, his trophy wife started secret phone calls, and his estranged son suddenly wanted to reconnect. But the biggest surprise wasn't who failed his test. It was who passed it in ways that would change his understanding of love, loyalty, and what it really means to be wealthy. Stay with us to witness the moment a powerful man's elaborate deception backfired in the most beautiful way possible. You'll discover which family members were planning to pull his life support, learn why his housekeeper's reaction made him question everything, and see how pretending to be vulnerable revealed strength he never knew he had. Because this isn't just about a rich man's paranoia. It's about the shocking things people do when they think no one is watching, the unexpected places we find genuine love, and why sometimes the best way to discover who cares about you is to pretend you're about to lose everything. The truth this billionaire uncovered will make you reconsider everyone in your own life. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life. Perfectly Empty. Marcus Wellington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered dollar by dollar. At 62, he commanded a business empire worth $2.8 billion, owned properties on 4 continents, and could make phone calls that moved stock markets. Yet as he stared at his reflection in the glass, all he saw was a stranger wearing an expensive suit. The morning had started like every other for the past 5 years. His assistant Jennifer brought coffee at exactly 7:15 a.m. His wife Clarissa texted him about another charity gala that needed his checkbook, and his lawyers called about another acquisition that would add more zeros to his already incomprehensible net worth. But today felt different. Today, the carefully orchestrated routine of his perfect life felt like a prison sentence. The catalyst had been simple enough. A phone call from his doctor's office, confirming his annual physical appointment for next week. Nothing unusual, nothing concerning, just a routine checkup that billionaires schedule like oil changes. But as Marcus hung up the phone, a thought crept into his mind, like poison ivy finding its way through concrete. When I die, who will actually miss me? The question should have been absurd. Marcus Wellington was loved by everyone. His wife of 15 years adored him. His son from his first marriage had recently started calling more often. His employees respected him. His social circle competed for invitations to his exclusive dinner parties. But respect wasn't love. Admiration wasn't affection. And Marcus was beginning to suspect that the people in his life were more interested in his bank account than his beating heart. He thought about Clarissa, his stunning second wife who was 22 years his junior. She'd married him 3 years after his messy divorce from Elena, promising to love him in sickness and in health. But when was the last time she'd asked about his day without immediately segueing into her own needs? When had she last touched him without wanting something? He thought about his son David, now 35 and perpetually struggling with his art career. David had been distant since the divorce, choosing his mother's side in the bitter custody battles. But lately he'd been calling more, visiting more, asking subtle questions about Marcus's retirement plans. Was this reconciliation genuine, or was David positioning himself for an inheritance he thought he might lose to his stepmother? Even his closest business partner, Richard Blackstone, had been making comments lately about Marcus slowing down and suggesting it might be time to transition leadership to the next generation. Richard owned 30% of their company. If Marcus died suddenly, Richard would likely gain control of everything. The more Marcus analyzed the relationships in his life, the more a terrifying pattern emerged. Everyone around him had a financial motive to maintain their connection. Everyone stood to gain something from his death. But surely he was being paranoid. Surely the people who claimed to love him actually did love him. There had to be a way to know for certain. That's when the idea struck him like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. What if he pretended to be dying? What if he could observe how people truly felt about him when they thought he had nothing left to offer but a funeral? The plan began forming immediately, detailed and devious. He would stage a terminal illness, something serious enough to make everyone believe his time was limited, but not so sudden that it would create chaos. He needed time to watch, to study, to see who his real family was when the chips were down. Cancer would be perfect. Pancreatic cancer specifically. Aggressive but not immediately fatal. It would give him months to observe behavior patterns while everyone believed he was fighting for his life. Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: excitement. For the first time in decades, he was about to undertake a project where money couldn't guarantee the outcome. This would be the ultimate test of human nature, and he would finally learn who deserved his love and his fortune. But as he began plotting the details of his elaborate deception, Marcus had no idea that his fake illness would reveal truths more devastating and beautiful than anything his real money had ever been able to buy. The game was about to begin, and everyone in his life was an unknowing player. Chapter 2. Setting the stage. Dr. Harrison Matthews had been Marcus's physician for 12 years, which made him both the perfect accomplice and the most dangerous liability in the Billionaire scheme. The distinguished cardiologist had built his practice on discretion, treating Hollywood celebrities, politicians, and tech moguls who valued privacy above all else. Marcus sat in Dr. Matthews's mahogany-paneled office 3 days after conceiving his plan, watching the doctor's face carefully as he made his unprecedented request. "You want me to help you fake terminal cancer?" Dr. Matthews repeated slowly, as if saying the words might make them less insane. "Marcus, I could lose my medical license. I could face criminal charges. Do you understand what you're asking?" "I understand I'm asking my trusted friend to help me discover who my real friends are," Marcus replied calmly. "Harrison, you've seen my test results for over a decade. You know I'm healthier than most 40-year-olds, but you've also heard me talk about my concerns regarding my family." Dr. Matthews leaned back in his leather chair, studying his patient with the analytical gaze that had made him one of the city's most respected physicians. "Marcus, there are other ways to evaluate people's motivations. Family therapy, honest conversations, private investigators, all of which they would see coming," Marcus interrupted. "Harrison, I'm not talking about a long-term deception. 6 months, maybe less. Just enough time to see who shows up when they think I'm vulnerable." The doctor was quiet for a long moment, considering implications that went far beyond medical ethics. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus had spent 3 sleepless nights perfecting his strategy. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. Aggressive but treatable with the right approach. You'll discover it during my routine physical next week. We'll say it was caught early enough that I have a fighting chance, but late enough that it's serious." "And the treatment?" "We'll create a protocol that explains why I'm getting tired more easily, why I might lose some weight, why I need to reduce my work schedule. Nothing that requires actual chemotherapy, but enough symptoms to make the illness believable." Dr. Matthews rubbed his temples. "Marcus, people will want second opinions. Your family will insist on consulting other specialists. Your wife will probably want to take you to Mayo Clinic or Johns Hopkins. Which is why I need your help creating a complete medical fiction. Fake test results, staged consultations with colleagues you trust, a treatment plan that requires specific protocols you happen to be pioneering. Make me a special case that requires your unique expertise." The doctor stared out his window at the city skyline, weighing a decision that would either help his friend find peace or destroy both their lives. "Why are you so convinced the people around you don't genuinely care about you?" Marcus had asked himself the same question, and the answer had kept him awake every night since his epiphany. "Harrison, when was the last time someone in my life asked me how I felt without wanting something in return? When did anyone show interest in my thoughts, my fears, my dreams that didn't somehow relate to my money?" "Your wife seems devoted." "My wife hasn't asked me about my childhood, my hopes, or my fears once in 15 years of marriage. She knows my net worth better than my middle name. She can recite my investment portfolio but couldn't tell you my favorite book." Dr. Matthews couldn't argue with that observation. In 12 years of treating Marcus, he'd watched the billionaire grow increasingly isolated, despite being surrounded by people competing for his attention. "And your son?" Marcus's expression darkened. "David has called me more in the past 6 months than in the previous 6 years. Suddenly, he wants to rebuild our relationship and understand the family business better. His art career is failing, Harrison. His mother is remarrying a man with significantly less money than she's accustomed to. David needs me to be his father again, but only because he needs my wallet to be his inheritance. The doctor had to admit Marcus's concerns weren't entirely paranoid. Wealth at his level created complex relationship dynamics that most people couldn't navigate honestly. What about your business partners? Your employees? Richard has been dropping hints about my legacy and succession planning for months. My employees are loyal to their paychecks. My board members are loyal to their stock options. Marcus leaned forward intently. Harrison, I built an empire, but I'm not sure I built a life. This is my chance to find out who sees Marcus the man instead of Marcus the bank account. Dr. Matthews understood the loneliness that came with extreme wealth. He'd treated enough billionaires to recognize the isolation that money could create. But this plan was dangerous on levels Marcus might not fully appreciate. Marcus, what if you discover that your worst fears are true? What if everyone really is just waiting for you to die so they can inherit your fortune? What will you do with that knowledge? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Marcus had considered this possibility, but he'd never articulated what his response would be. Then I'll know who deserves my legacy and who deserves nothing, he said finally. I'd rather die knowing the truth than live surrounded by beautiful lies. Dr. Matthews recognized the determination in his friend's voice. Marcus Wellington hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by accepting uncertainty when answers were available. If I agree to help you, the doctor said carefully, we do this my way. No dramatic collapses, no emergency room visits, no situations that could endanger your actual health. And we establish an exit strategy from the beginning. This ends the moment it becomes too dangerous to continue. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude mixed with anticipation. You'll help me? I'll help you, Dr. Matthews confirmed, but I want one thing in return. After this is over, regardless of what you discover, you have to promise me you'll get professional help processing whatever truths emerge. Deal? Deal. Marcus shook his doctor's hand, sealing an agreement that would either save his soul or destroy his life. Neither man realized they were about to unleash forces that would spiral far beyond their control, revealing secrets that went deeper than money and lies that had been buried for decades. The performance was about to begin, and Marcus Wellington was about to discover that he wasn't the only one in his family capable of masterful deception. Chapter 3. The Diagnosis. The call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Marcus's routine physical. He was in his office reviewing quarterly reports when Dr. Matthews's number appeared on his private line. Marcus? The doctor's voice was perfectly calibrated, concerned but not panicked, serious but not hopeless. I need you to come in this afternoon. We got your test results back, and I'd like to discuss them in person. Even though Marcus knew this was theater, hearing those words sent an unexpected chill down his spine. How serious are we talking, Harrison? Let's just say I'd prefer to have this conversation face to face. Can you be here at 3? I'll be there. Marcus hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, surprised by his own emotional response to a phone call he'd orchestrated. The human mind, he realized, was remarkably susceptible to suggestion, even when the suggestion came from oneself. He spent the next 4 hours in a strange state of suspended reality, going through the motions of his normal routine while mentally preparing for the performance that was about to begin. By the time he walked into Dr. Matthews' office that afternoon, he'd almost convinced himself he was actually about to receive devastating news. Marcus, please sit down, Dr. Matthews said, his demeanor appropriately grave. He'd spent the morning practicing this conversation, creating fake test results, and coordinating with 2 colleagues who'd agreed to participate in the elaborate deception. The doctor spread several official-looking documents across his desk, each one carefully crafted to support the narrative they were building. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The blood work we did last week revealed some concerning markers. We ran additional tests, including a CT scan and a biopsy, and I'm afraid the results confirm my suspicions. Marcus looked down at the papers, seeing perfectly fabricated evidence of his own fictional mortality. Dr. Matthews had outdone himself. The reports looked absolutely authentic. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, the doctor continued. It's aggressive, but we caught it early enough that treatment is definitely an option. However, I won't lie to you, this is going to be a fight. The words hung in the air between them. Marcus found himself experiencing genuine emotions despite knowing this was all a performance. The human psyche, it seemed, couldn't entirely distinguish between real and simulated crisis. What's the prognosis? Marcus asked, his voice naturally hoarse with manufactured fear. With aggressive treatment, we're looking at a 70% 5-year survival rate. Without treatment, Dr. Matthews paused meaningfully. Marcus, we need to start immediately. I'm recommending a specialized protocol that combines chemotherapy with an experimental treatment I've been developing. It's shown remarkable results, but it requires that you work exclusively with my team. This was the crucial element of their plan. By positioning Dr. Matthews as the only physician capable of treating Marcus's unique case, they could control the narrative and prevent other doctors from discovering the deception. How long do we have? Marcus asked. If we start treatment next week, your prognosis is good. But Marcus, this is going to change everything. The treatment will make you tired. You might lose weight. You'll need to reduce your work schedule significantly. Your family needs to know what's happening so they can support you through this. Marcus nodded slowly, his mind already racing ahead to the next phase of his plan. Harrison, I need to ask you for something unusual. I don't want my family to know how serious this is right away. I need time to process this myself before I deal with their reactions. Dr. Matthews looked appropriately concerned. Marcus, isolation isn't healthy when you're facing something like this. Your support system will smother me with good intentions, Marcus interrupted. Harrison, you know how my family operates. The moment they know about this, it becomes about them. Their fear, their guilt, their need to manage the situation. I need a few weeks to come to terms with this myself. This was partially true. Marcus did need time, but not to process his fake diagnosis. He needed time to establish baseline behavioral patterns so he could accurately measure how people's treatment of him changed once they learned about his illness. I understand your concerns, Dr. Matthews said carefully, but I strongly recommend telling your wife immediately. Clarissa deserves to know what you're both facing. Give me 2 weeks, Marcus pleaded. Let me start treatment, see how I respond, get a better sense of what we're dealing with. Then I'll tell everyone. Dr. Matthews appeared to consider this request before reluctantly agreeing. 2 weeks, Marcus. After that, your family needs to be involved. You're going to need their support more than you realize. As Marcus left his doctor's office that afternoon, carrying a folder full of fabricated medical documents, he felt a complex mixture of excitement and trepidation. The game had officially begun. But as he drove home through the city traffic, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing a line from which there might be no return. He was about to lie to everyone he claimed to love, manipulating their emotions and testing their loyalty in ways that would either prove their devotion or destroy their relationships forever. The irony wasn't lost on him. In his effort to discover who truly cared about him, he was about to become someone who deserved not to be cared about at all. But it was too late to turn back now. The performance had begun, and Marcus Wellington was about to discover whether he was the hero or the villain of his own story. Chapter 4. The First Performance. Marcus spent the next 3 days studying himself in mirrors, practicing subtle changes that would suggest a man who'd just learned he was dying. He experimented with slightly hunched shoulders, slower movements, and a distant expression that hinted at internal battles being fought. The acting wasn't as difficult as he'd expected. Once he committed to the role, his body seemed to naturally adopt the posture of vulnerability. Perhaps, he thought, we all carry the seeds of our own mortality so close to the surface that pretending to face death simply required acknowledging what was already there. His first test subject would be Jennifer, his assistant of 8 years. If anyone would notice subtle changes in his behavior, it would be the woman who managed every detail of his professional life. Good morning, Mr. Wellington, Jennifer said as he entered his office Thursday morning, 3 days after his fake diagnosis. She was already at her desk adjacent to his, having arrived an hour early as she did every day to prepare for his arrival. "Morning, Jen," Marcus replied, his voice carrying just a hint of fatigue that wasn't entirely manufactured. The stress of maintaining this deception was already taking its toll. He moved more slowly than usual as he hung up his coat, allowing his shoulders to sag slightly as if carrying invisible weight. When he sat down at his desk, he paused for a moment longer than necessary, as though gathering energy for simple tasks. Jennifer looked up from her computer screen, her brow furrowed with concern. "Are you feeling all right? You seem tired." The question hit Marcus with unexpected force. When was the last time anyone had asked about his well-being without being prompted? When had anyone noticed his physical state before he announced it? "Just haven't been sleeping well lately," Anki said, which was actually true. "Too much on my mind." Jennifer studied him for another moment before returning to her work, but Marcus caught her glancing at him several more times throughout the morning. Her concern appeared genuine, unburdened by any obvious ulterior motives. She wasn't family, wasn't in his will, and had no reason to pretend to care about his health beyond basic human decency. This realization both comforted and unsettled him. If his assistant could notice and care about subtle changes in his well-being, why couldn't the people who claimed to love him? His phone buzzed with a text from Clarissa. "Don't forget we have dinner with the Hendersons tonight. Wear your navy suit." "No, how are you feeling today?" "No, looking forward to seeing you tonight." Just instructions about clothing choices for a social obligation that served her networking needs more than their marital connection. Marcus stared at the text for a long moment before responding. "Might be a little tired tonight, but I'll be there." Her reply came instantly. "You can rest this weekend. The Hendersons are important for the museum board position." Even when he hinted at not feeling well, her focus remained on how his condition might affect her social ambitions. Marcus saved the text exchange as evidence, though he wasn't sure what he was trying to prove or to whom. The day progressed with Marcus making subtle adjustments to his normal routine. He declined his usual working lunch, claiming he wasn't hungry. He left the office an hour earlier than normal, telling Jennifer he had a headache. Each small change felt like a breadcrumb he was dropping, creating a trail that would either lead to genuine concern from those who loved him or reveal the emptiness he suspected lay at the heart of his relationships. Dinner with the Hendersons provided the perfect opportunity to observe Clarissa's behavior when she thought he might not be at his best. The Hendersons were old money, the kind of established wealth that made even billionaires feel like nouveau riche pretenders. Clarissa had been cultivating their friendship for months, hoping to secure a position on the board of their prestigious art museum. "Marcus, you look wonderful," Mrs. Henderson said as they were seated at the country club. "Clarissa tells us you've been working too hard as usual." "Guilty as charged," Marcus replied, managing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sometimes I forget I'm not 30 anymore." "Nonsense," Mr. Henderson laughed. "You could buy and sell half the men in this room, and you're probably in better shape than most of them, too." Marcus noticed how quickly the conversation turned to his wealth and power. Even among social equals, his identity was defined by his financial success, rather than his character or personality. Throughout dinner, he watched Clarissa perform her own elaborate show, charming the Hendersons with stories about their recent trip to the Hamptons, their plans for renovating their yacht, and her vision for modernizing the museum's fundraising strategies. She was brilliant at this kind of social theater, Marcus had to admit. She could make anyone feel like the most interesting person in the room, while simultaneously advancing her own agenda. But she never once asked how he was feeling. Never noticed that he ate less than usual or that he seemed quieter than normal. Her attention was so focused on her performance for the Hendersons that she was oblivious to any changes in her husband's behavior. "Darling, tell them about your new acquisition strategy," she said at one point, turning to Marcus with a smile that was perfectly calculated to suggest wifely pride. Marcus obliged, discussing his latest business ventures while part of his mind observed the dynamic playing out around him. Clarissa was using him as a prop in her own performance, showcasing his success to impress people she wanted to influence. He was her most valuable accessory, more important than her jewelry but less important than her ambitions. The realization stung more than he'd expected. As they drove home that night, Clarissa chatted excitedly about her successful evening. "I think Elizabeth Henderson was genuinely impressed with my ideas for the museum. She practically invited me to join the board herself." That's wonderful, Marcus said quietly, his energy genuinely depleted by the evening's performance. Are you being sarcastic? Clarissa asked, finally noticing his subdued tone. No, I'm happy for you. I'm just tired. You've been saying that a lot lately. Maybe you should see Harrison about getting some vitamins or something. I can't have you falling asleep at charity galas. Marcus almost laughed at the irony. His wife was recommending he see the very doctor who was helping him fake terminal cancer, and her concern was focused on how his fatigue might affect their social calendar. I actually have an appointment with him next week, Marcus said truthfully. Good. Make sure you get whatever you need to get your energy back. We have 3 major events this month, and I need you at your best. As they pulled into their driveway, Marcus realized that his first day of pretending to be sick had already taught him something profound and heartbreaking. The people closest to him had become so accustomed to seeing him as a source of utility rather than a human being that they'd lost the ability to recognize when he might need their care instead of their constant demands. But the test was just beginning. Tomorrow he would have to start telling people about his diagnosis, and then he would learn whether shocking news about his mortality could awaken genuine love from hearts that had grown cold with comfort and greed. Marcus fell asleep that night wondering if he was about to discover that he was the richest and loneliest man in the world. Chapter 5. Breaking the news. Marcus decided to tell his son David first. If anyone should care about his father's mortality, it should be the child he'd raised, loved, and supported through 35 years of life. Their relationship had been strained since his divorce from Elena, but surely news of terminal cancer would cut through years of accumulated resentment and awaken whatever filial love remained between them. He called David Friday morning and asked him to come to the house that evening. There's something important I need to discuss with you, Marcus said, his voice carrying the appropriate weight of serious news. Is everything okay? David asked, and Marcus felt a flicker of hope at what sounded like genuine concern. We'll talk tonight. Can you be here around 7? Of course, Dad, you're scaring me a little. Is this about business? About Mom? Just come tonight, David. Everything will make sense then. Marcus spent the day preparing for what would be the most important performance of his elaborate deception. He practiced the words he would use, the emotions he would display, the vulnerability he would allow his son to witness. If this didn't awaken David's love, nothing would. David arrived precisely at 7, which was unusual. He was typically 15 to 30 minutes late for everything, a habit that had annoyed Marcus for years. Tonight, his punctuality suggested he was genuinely worried about his father. They sat in Marcus's study, a room lined with first edition books and decorated with awards from his decades of business success. David looked nervous, fidgeting with his coffee cup and avoiding direct eye contact. David, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you react. Marcus began, his voice steady but serious. I went to see Dr. Matthews for my annual physical last week. David's posture straightened immediately, his full attention focused on his father. The blood work came back showing some concerning markers. We ran additional tests, and the results weren't what we hoped for. Marcus paused, watching his son's face for signs of genuine emotion. I have pancreatic cancer, David. Stage 3. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. David's coffee cup slipped from his hand, clattering against the saucer and spilling across the antique side table. His face went pale, then flushed, cycling through a spectrum of shock. What does that mean? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Stage 3, is that... Are you... It's serious, Marcus continued, but it's treatable? Dr. Matthews caught it early enough that I have a good chance with aggressive treatment. The survival rate is around 70% if we start immediately. David stared at his father as if seeing him for the first time. Cancer, he repeated, as though testing the word's weight on his tongue. Jesus, Dad, How do you feel? Are you in pain? What can I do? The questions came rapidly, overlapping each other as David struggled to process the information. Marcus felt a surge of genuine emotion watching his son's distress. This reaction seemed authentic. The shock, the immediate concern, the instinctive desire to help. I'm starting treatment next week, Marcus said. Harrison has me on an experimental protocol that he thinks will be very effective. But David, I need you to know that this is going to change some things. I'll need to reduce my work schedule. I might not have as much energy as I used to. Fuck work, David said with surprising vehemence. Dad, work doesn't matter right now. Family matters. We need to get you the best doctors, the best treatment, whatever you need. Marcus was genuinely moved by his son's response. Harrison is the best, and he's coordinating with specialists at Johns Hopkins and Mayo. We have a plan. David stood up abruptly and began pacing the room, running his hands through his hair. Mom needs to know about this. And Clarissa. And we need to make sure you're not dealing with any unnecessary stress. Maybe I should move back home for a while, help you through the treatment. David, I appreciate that, but I don't want my illness to disrupt everyone else's lives. Disrupt our lives? David spun around to face his father. Dad, you're talking about cancer. You're talking about the possibility of... I can't even say it. Nothing is more important than making sure you beat this thing. For a moment, Marcus felt terrible about his deception. David's reaction seemed so genuinely loving, so immediately focused on his father's well-being, rather than any personal consequences. Maybe he'd been wrong about his son's motivations. Maybe their relationship really had been healing. But then David sat back down and something in his expression shifted. The initial shock was fading, replaced by something that looked almost like calculation. Dad, we need to talk about practical things too, David said, his voice taking on a more businesslike tone. Your will, your business succession plans, making sure everything is organized in case the treatment doesn't work as well as we hope. There it was. Marcus felt his heart sink as he recognized the familiar pattern reasserting itself. Even in the face of his father's mortality, David's mind had quickly moved to questions of inheritance and control. It's too early to worry about that, Marcus said carefully. Let's focus on treatment first. Of course, absolutely, David said quickly, perhaps recognizing that he'd revealed his hand too early. I just meant, it's good to be prepared, to have everything organized so you don't have to worry about business details while you're focusing on getting better. Marcus studied his son's face, looking for signs of the genuine love and concern he'd seen moments earlier. It was still there, mixed with the calculated interest in practical matters. David wasn't entirely mercenary. He did seem to care about his father's health. But he also couldn't stop himself from thinking about what his father's death might mean for his own future. They talked for another hour, with David asking detailed questions about the treatment plan, the timeline, and the prognosis. He offered to accompany Marcus to medical appointments, to research additional treatment options, to coordinate with other family members. His concern seemed genuine, but it was complicated by his obvious awareness of the financial implications of his father's mortality. As David prepared to leave, he embraced Marcus with unusual intensity. I love you, Dad, he said, and Marcus could hear emotion in his voice. We're going to beat this. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, we're going to get you through this. After David left, Marcus sat alone in his study, trying to process what he'd learned from his son's reaction. The response had been more complex than he'd anticipated. David clearly did love him and was genuinely distressed by the news of his illness. But even in his shock and concern, he couldn't entirely separate his father's mortality from his own financial interests. Was this natural human behavior, Marcus wondered, or evidence of the corrosive effect his wealth had on even the most intimate relationships? Would any child be able to hear news of their parents' terminal illness without thinking about inheritance, especially when that inheritance represented generational wealth? Or was David's reaction proof that Marcus's worst fears were justified? That even his own son saw him primarily as a financial resource, rather than simply as a father deserving of unconditional love? Marcus poured himself a scotch and stared out the window at the city lights, realizing that his test was already revealing truths more complicated and painful than he'd prepared himself to discover. Tomorrow, he would have to tell Clarissa. And then he would learn whether 15 years of marriage had created genuine love, or merely a sophisticated business partnership disguised as romance. Chapter 6. The Wife's Reaction. Marcus chose Saturday morning to tell Clarissa, timing the conversation for when they would have privacy and plenty of time to talk through the implications. He found her in their home solarium, reading the society pages and planning her weekend activities. She looked beautiful in the morning light, her blonde hair perfectly styled even for a casual Saturday at home. Her silk robe probably costing more than most people's monthly salaries. At 40, she maintained the kind of effortless elegance that had first attracted Marcus 15 years ago when she was working as an art curator, and he was recently divorced and looking for someone who understood his world of wealth and social obligation. "Clarissa, I need to talk to you about something important," he said, sitting down across from her at the small table where she'd arranged her coffee, croissant, and newspapers with characteristic precision. She looked up from her reading, immediately alert to the serious tone in his voice. "What's wrong? You've been acting strange all week." Marcus had rehearsed this conversation even more carefully than his talk with David. Clarissa was more observant than his son, more attuned to emotional nuances, and potentially more dangerous if she suspected any deception. "I got some test results back from my physical," he began, using the same opening he'd practiced with David. "Clarissa, I have cancer. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The words hit her like a physical blow. Her coffee cup dropped from her hands, shattering against the marble floor and sending porcelain fragments scattering across the room. Her face went white, then her hands began trembling. "No," she whispered, staring at him as if she could make the words untrue through sheer force of will. "No, Marcus, that's not... You're healthy. You just had your physical. There must be a mistake." "There's no mistake," Marcus said gently, reaching across the table to take her shaking hands in his. "Dr. Matthews ran the tests twice. We caught it early enough that treatment should be effective, but it's definitely cancer." Clarissa began crying. Not the delicate tears that enhanced her beauty at charity galas, but raw, ugly sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuine inside her. "How long?" she managed to ask between gasps. "With treatment, the 5-year survival rate is around 70%. Without treatment, Harrison says maybe 6 months to a year." "Then we treat it," she said immediately, her voice gaining strength through her tears. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, we fight this thing. I'll call every specialist in the country. I'll fly us to Switzerland if I have to. Marcus, we're going to beat this." Her reaction was so immediate, so fierce that Marcus felt another stab of guilt about his deception. This wasn't the calculated response of a gold digger protecting her investment. This was the raw terror of a woman who thought she was about to lose her husband. "Clarissa," he said softly, "Dr. Matthews has me on an excellent treatment protocol. We're going to start next week, and he's very optimistic about the results." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, streaking her makeup but clearly not caring about her appearance for once. "I want to meet with him myself. I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with, what the treatment involves, what I can do to help." "Of course," Marcus agreed, touched by her immediate desire to be involved in his care. "But right now, I need you to understand that this is going to change things. The treatment will make me tired. I might lose weight. I'll need to reduce my work schedule significantly." "I don't care about any of that," Clarissa said fiercely. "Work can wait. Social obligations can wait. Everything can wait except getting you healthy." Marcus watched his wife's face carefully, looking for any sign that her concern was manufactured, or that she was already calculating the implications of his mortality. But all he saw was genuine fear and fierce determination to fight for his life. "There's something else," he said, testing her further. "Harrison recommended that we keep this private for now. No announcements, no telling our friends. He wants to see how I respond to the initial treatment before we deal with everyone else's reactions." Most gold diggers, Marcus reasoned, would want to publicize his illness immediately to position themselves as the devoted wife caring for her dying husband. But Clarissa nodded emphatically. "Absolutely. The last thing you need is everyone treating you like you're already dead or trying to manage your illness for you. We'll tell people when you're ready, when we know more about how the treatment is working." She stood up abruptly and began pacing the solarium, her mind clearly racing. "We need to make sure you're getting the best possible care. I'll research everything about pancreatic cancer, the latest treatments, clinical trials, specialists who are doing groundbreaking work, and we need to make sure you're not dealing with any unnecessary stress." "Clarissa?" "No, Marcus, listen to me." She stopped pacing and looked directly at him, her eyes still red from crying but blazing with determination. You've spent your entire adult life taking care of everyone else. You built a fortune that supports hundreds of employees. You've donated millions to charity. You've provided for David and me and everyone in your orbit. Now it's time for us to take care of you. Us too. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, and Marcus felt his carefully constructed test beginning to crumble around the edges. Maybe he'd been wrong about Clarissa. Maybe her focus on social events and charitable boards wasn't evidence of shallow materialism, but simply the way she contributed to their shared life. Maybe her love for him was real, just expressed in ways he hadn't learned to recognize. But as the morning progressed and Clarissa threw herself into researching his condition, Marcus began to notice subtle changes in her behavior that troubled him. She made several phone calls that she took in private, speaking in hushed tones that he couldn't quite overhear. When he asked who she was calling, she said she was consulting with friends who had medical connections, trying to identify the best oncologists in the country. That seemed reasonable, even admirable. But something about the secrecy of the calls bothered him. She also began asking detailed questions about his treatment timeline, his work schedule, and his plans for managing business responsibilities during his illness. Again, these seemed like natural concerns for a wife to have. But there was something in the way she asked these questions that reminded Marcus of the way she approached social planning, with an agenda that went beyond the obvious. "Marcus," she said over lunch, "have you thought about whether you want to tell the board about your condition? They'll need to know if you're going to be less available for major decisions." "It's too early for that," Marcus replied. "Let's see how the treatment goes first." "Of course, but at some point they'll need to know. And your partners will need to understand if you're going to be delegating more responsibility. I'm just thinking about how to manage the transition smoothly." There was that word again. Transition. David had used similar language, and now Clarissa was talking about transitioning his responsibilities as if his illness was already a foregone conclusion, rather than a battle to be fought. "Clarissa, I'm not planning to transition anything right now. I'm planning to beat this cancer and get back to normal life." "Absolutely," she said quickly. "I just meant temporarily while you're going through treatment. I want to make sure you can focus on getting better without worrying about business pressures." "Aiko?" Her explanation made perfect sense, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that she was already thinking several moves ahead, planning for contingencies that went beyond his recovery. That afternoon, while Clarissa was at her yoga class, Marcus found himself wandering through their house with new eyes. He looked at the art collection she'd assembled, the furniture she'd chosen, the lifestyle she'd created around his wealth. Everything was beautiful, tasteful, and expensive, but how much of it reflected genuine shared interests versus her individual preferences funded by his money? He realized he didn't actually know what Clarissa would do with herself if his fortune disappeared tomorrow. Her entire adult life had been structured around wealth. First as an art curator serving wealthy collectors, then as his wife managing their social obligations and philanthropic activities. Who was she when money wasn't part of the equation? And more troubling, who was he? Marcus realized that his own identity had become so intertwined with his wealth that he wasn't sure what would be left if everything else was stripped away. Maybe that was why this test felt so necessary. He needed to know not just who would love him without his money, but whether there was anything about him worth loving beyond his bank account. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Clarissa approached him with unusual tenderness. She helped him with his shirt buttons, ran her fingers through his hair, and looked at him with an expression of such deep love that Marcus almost confessed his deception on the spot. "I love you," she whispered as they lay in the darkness. "Whatever happens, whatever we have to face, I love you. We're going to get through this together." Marcus held her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his and listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. In that moment, he wanted desperately to believe that her love was real, that his fears about their relationship were just the paranoid suspicions of a man who'd spent too much time thinking about money and not enough time trusting in human goodness. But doubt was a virus that had already infected his bloodstream. Even as he held his wife and felt grateful for her apparent devotion, part of his mind was cataloging the questions that still needed answers. Why had she taken those private phone calls? Why was she so focused on transition planning? And why did her expressions of love always seem to be followed by practical discussions about managing his responsibilities? Marcus fell asleep that night more confused than ever. His test was supposed to reveal clear truths about people's motivations, but instead it was showing him that human relationships were infinitely more complex than simple categories of love and greed. Tomorrow he would have to start his fake treatment and begin the most challenging phase of his deception. And he was beginning to suspect that the person he might end up hurting most wasn't anyone in his family. It was himself. Chapter 7. The treatment begins. Doctor. Matthews had outdone himself in creating a believable treatment protocol for Marcus's fictional cancer. The experimental therapy required Marcus to visit the medical center 3 times a week for sessions that would supposedly combine targeted chemotherapy with an innovative immunotherapy approach that Dr. Matthews was pioneering. In reality, these sessions involved Marcus sitting in a private room for several hours, while receiving IV fluids that would help him maintain the appearance of someone undergoing cancer treatment. Dr. Matthews had also provided him with medications that would create convincing side effects, mild fatigue, occasional nausea, and gradual weight loss that could be attributed to the aggressive treatment regimen. Remember, Dr. Matthews said as they prepared for Marcus's first fake treatment session, the key to maintaining this deception is consistency. You need to look and act like someone who's fighting cancer, but not so dramatically that people become suspicious or want to seek second opinions. Marcus nodded, settling into the comfortable chair where he would spend the next 4 hours pretending to receive life-saving medicine. Harrison, I have to ask, are you having any second thoughts about this? Because if you want to stop... I'm having second, third, and fourth thoughts, the doctor interrupted. But I'm also seeing how this is affecting you, Marcus. You're already discovering things about your relationships that you needed to know. Just promise me we'll end this before it goes too far. Define too far, Marcus said, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Too far is when you start believing your own lies. Too far is when this fake illness becomes an excuse to avoid real intimacy. Too far is when you use what you're learning to justify cutting people out of your life without giving them a chance to prove their love is genuine. Dr. Matthews's warning resonated more deeply than Marcus cared to admit. He was already finding it difficult to separate his genuine emotions from his manufactured ones. The line between testing people's love and manipulating their feelings was thinner than he'd anticipated. His first treatment session coincided with Clarissa's book club meeting, which meant she wouldn't be available to drive him home or fuss over his condition immediately afterward. This was actually perfect for Marcus's purposes. He wanted to observe how she balanced her own activities with his medical needs. I can reschedule the book club, she'd offered that morning. I should be there with you for your first treatment. Absolutely not, Marcus had replied. Harrison says the treatment will just make me sleepy. There's no point in you sitting there watching me nap for 4 hours. Keep your normal schedule. I need some things in our life to stay normal. Clarissa had looked torn between relief and guilt, which Marcus found interesting. She clearly wanted to maintain her social obligations, but she also seemed genuinely concerned about abandoning him during treatment. Are you sure? I can always read the book another month. I'm sure, but maybe you could pick up some of that ginger tea you bought last time I had the flu. Dr. Matthews said it might help with any nausea. Her face lit up with purpose. Of course, I'll stop by that specialty tea shop and get several varieties, and I'll pick up some of those crackers you like in case your appetite changes. Marcus felt another pang of guilt watching her eagerness to care for him in small, practical ways. Maybe he'd been underestimating the value of these gestures. Maybe love wasn't always expressed in grand declarations, but sometimes in remembering which tea helped with nausea. The fake treatment session gave Marcus 4 hours to think, which turned out to be both a blessing and a curse. With nothing to do but sit and reflect, he found himself analyzing every interaction he'd had since announcing his diagnosis. David had called 3 times in 2 days, each conversation mixing genuine concern about his father's health with subtle questions about business succession planning. His son seemed to be walking a tightrope between appropriate filial care and inappropriate financial interest. Clarissa had thrown herself into researching his condition with impressive thoroughness, but she'd also been making those mysterious private phone calls and asking questions about his business responsibilities that went beyond simple concern for his well-being. Even Jennifer, his assistant, had started treating him differently, bringing him herbal tea instead of coffee, scheduling fewer meetings, and asking if he needed anything special to make his work environment more comfortable. Her attentiveness seemed entirely genuine, motivated by nothing more than basic human kindness. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that his employee was showing him more unconditional care than his family members, who stood to inherit millions from his death. His phone buzzed with a text from Richard Blackstone, his business partner. "Heard from David that you're dealing with some health issues. Call me when you're ready to talk. Here to help with whatever you need." Marcus stared at the message, trying to decode its implications. David had told Richard about his diagnosis despite Marcus specifically asking him to keep the information private for now. Why had his son felt the need to share this news with his father's business partner? He called David immediately. "Dad, how's the treatment going?" David answered, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine concern. "It's going fine, but I have a question. Why did you tell Richard about my diagnosis? I asked you to keep this private for now." There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "I didn't tell Richard about your cancer, Dad. I just mentioned that you were dealing with some health issues and might need to adjust your schedule. He was asking about the quarterly review meeting you postponed." Marcus wasn't entirely convinced. "What exactly did you say to him?" "Just that you had some medical stuff going on and needed to focus on that right now. I didn't give him any details about the diagnosis or prognosis. I thought he should know why you might be less available so he wouldn't take it personally or start worrying about the business." The explanation sounded reasonable, but it also revealed that David was already thinking about how his father's illness would affect business relationships. A loving son might focus on medical care and emotional support. A son concerned about inheritance might also worry about maintaining stable business partnerships during his father's treatment. "David, I appreciate you looking out for the business, but in the future, please let me decide what to tell people and when to tell them." "Of course, absolutely. I'm sorry if I overstepped. I was just trying to help." After hanging up, Marcus sat in his treatment chair and wondered if he was becoming paranoid or if his suspicions were justified. Every conversation seemed to have multiple layers. Every gesture of concern seemed mixed with self-interest. When Dr. Matthews checked on him an hour later, Marcus shared his confusion. "Harrison, I'm starting to think this test is flawed. Everyone's behavior is ambiguous. David seems to love me, but also thinks about money. Clarissa appears devoted, but asks suspicious questions. How am I supposed to know what their true motivations are?" Dr. Matthews pulled up a chair beside Marcus's treatment station. "Maybe that's the answer right there. Maybe human motivations are always mixed, always complicated. Maybe the question isn't whether people love you or want your money. Maybe it's whether they love you in spite of also wanting your money." That's not very comforting. "Truth rarely is," the doctor replied. "But Marcus, consider this. You've built your entire identity around being wealthy and powerful. You've trained everyone in your life to see you as a provider, a problem solver, a source of security and opportunity. Now you're testing whether they can see you as anything else, but you've never given them practice at loving you when you're vulnerable." This observation hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. Had he created the very dynamic he was now resenting? Had he taught people to relate to him through his wealth and then become angry when they couldn't immediately switch to relating to him through pure emotion? "So what are you saying, that this whole test is unfair?" "I'm saying that relationships are systems," Dr. Matthews replied. "If you want different results, you might need to change the entire system, not just test people's responses within the existing dynamic." As Marcus left the medical center that afternoon, walking slowly to maintain his performance of post-treatment fatigue, he realized that his elaborate deception was teaching him more about himself than about anyone else. He'd wanted to discover who truly loved him, but he was beginning to suspect that the more important question was whether he'd ever allowed himself to be truly lovable. The test would continue, but Marcus was no longer sure he wanted to know the results. Chapter 8. Unexpected Allies. The most surprising development in Marcus's elaborate test came from the most unexpected source: Maria Sanos, the housekeeper who had worked for his family for 12 years. Maria was 62 years old, spoke English with a slight accent that revealed her El Salvadoran roots, and had never asked Marcus for anything beyond her weekly salary and occasional time off to visit her grandchildren. Marcus had barely considered how Maria might react to news of his illness. She was an employee, not family, and he'd always maintained a polite but professional distance with household staff. But on the Wednesday after his first fake treatment, Maria's behavior began to change in ways that caught his attention. She started arriving an hour earlier than usual, claiming she wanted to have fresh fruit and herbal tea ready for him when he came downstairs. She began preparing softer, more easily digestible meals without being asked, and she started doing his laundry with a gentleness that suggested she was handling precious artifacts rather than expensive clothing. "Mr. Marcus," she said one morning as she brought him breakfast in bed, something she'd never done before. "I hope you don't mind, but I called my sister Rosa. She works for a family in Mexico City, and the father had pancreatic cancer 2 years ago. He's doing very well now. Rosa wanted to give me some recipes for foods that might help you feel stronger during treatment." Marcus was genuinely touched by this gesture. "Maria, that's very thoughtful, but you don't need to change anything about how you prepare meals." "Is no trouble," she replied firmly. "Rosa says ginger soup and chamomile tea helped very much. And she says prayer helped too. My whole family is praying for you, Mr. Marcus." The idea that Maria's extended family, people who had never met him and never would, were praying for his recovery moved Marcus in a way he hadn't anticipated. Here was care with no possible ulterior motive, kindness from people who couldn't benefit from his death or his life. Over the following days, Marcus began to notice other small acts of service from Maria that went far beyond her job description. She started leaving little notes with his breakfast tray, scripture verses in Spanish with English translations, quotes about courage and healing, and simple messages like, "You are stronger than you know." When he asked her about the notes, Maria's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Marcus, you gave my Carlos scholarship money for college 10 years ago. You probably don't remember, but you changed my grandson's whole life. He's doctor now, pediatric doctor, because you believed in him when nobody else would. My family owes you everything." Marcus did remember Carlos, a bright teenager who had needed financial help to attend pre-med school. He'd written the check without thinking much about it, the way he handled dozens of scholarship requests every year. But clearly, this gesture had meant far more to Maria's family than he'd realized. "Carlos wants to come visit you," Maria continued. "He wants to talk to you about your treatment, maybe help you understand what to expect. He says is the least he can do for the man who made his dream possible." This offer created a complicated problem for Marcus. He couldn't have Maria's grandson, an actual doctor, examining him or reviewing his fake medical records. But he also couldn't reject the gesture without seeming ungrateful for what was clearly a heartfelt offer. "That's very kind of Carlos," Marcus said carefully, "but Dr. Matthews prefers to coordinate all my care himself. He's very particular about his treatment protocols." Maria nodded understandingly. Of course, but maybe Carlos could just visit sometime? Not as doctor, just as friend? He always wanted to thank you properly for the scholarship." Marcus agreed to a social visit, touched by the young man's gratitude and Maria's pride in her grandson's success. But the interaction also made him realize how little he knew about the lives of the people who worked for him. Maria had been a constant presence in his home for 12 years, but he'd never asked about her family, her dreams, or her struggles. He'd treated her kindly but impersonally, the way he might treat any competent service provider. Now, facing his fake mortality, he was discovering that this woman he'd barely noticed was capable of extraordinary compassion and loyalty. She was caring for him not because she had to, not because she hoped to gain anything, but because he'd once shown kindness to her family and she felt genuinely grateful. The contrast with his family's reactions was stark and troubling. Meanwhile, his relationships with Clarissa and David were becoming increasingly complex. Both continued to express love and concern, but both also continued to ask questions and to make suggestions that seemed to have ulterior motives. Clarissa had started meeting with their financial advisor without him, claiming she wanted to understand their assets better so she could help manage them during his treatment. When Marcus asked why she needed this information, she explained that she wanted to be prepared to handle financial decisions if his treatment made him too tired to focus on business matters. "I just want to make sure everything is organized," she said. "I don't want you worrying about money when you should be focusing on getting better." David had made similar moves, scheduling meetings with Marcus's lawyers to discuss updating estate planning documents to reflect current circumstances. He claimed he was trying to reduce his father's stress by handling administrative details. But Marcus couldn't help noticing that these administrative details all seemed to involve the distribution of his wealth. "Dad, I know this is difficult to think about," David had said during one of their conversations, "but we need to make sure your affairs are in order. If something unexpected happens during treatment, we want to be sure your wishes are clearly documented." Both Clarissa and David framed their actions as caring gestures designed to reduce Marcus's burden during his illness. But both were also positioning themselves to have more control over his financial empire, just in case his treatment didn't succeed. The more Marcus observed these dynamics, the more he appreciated Maria's simple, uncomplicating kindness. She wasn't trying to manage his money or organize his affairs. She was just trying to take care of him in the most basic human ways possible. But Maria's genuine care also made Marcus feel worse about his deception. She was praying for him, cooking special meals for him, and worrying about his health, all based on a lie he was telling to test other people's motivations. Her kindness was collateral damage in his elaborate scheme, and he began to feel genuinely guilty about accepting her care under false pretenses. One evening, as Maria prepared to leave after making him a special dinner designed to help with chemotherapy side effects, Marcus almost confessed everything. She looked so concerned, so genuinely worried about his well-being, that the weight of his lie felt unbearable. "Maria," he started, "I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you're doing for me." "Is nothing, Mr. Marcus. You would do same for me if I was sick." The simple assumption that he would care for her the way she was caring for him hit Marcus like a physical blow. Would he? If Maria was diagnosed with cancer tomorrow, would he go out of his way to help her through treatment? Would he even know if she was sick unless it affected her ability to work? The honest answer was that he probably wouldn't know, and probably wouldn't help in any meaningful way. He might send flowers to the hospital or write a generous check, but he wouldn't show up at her bedside or cook special meals or organize prayer circles for her recovery. This realization forced Marcus to confront an uncomfortable truth about his own character. He was testing other people's capacity for love and loyalty, but when had he demonstrated those same qualities? When had he loved someone without expecting anything in return? When had he shown kindness that couldn't be attributed to charity tax write-offs or social obligations? Maybe the problem wasn't that people loved him for his money. Maybe the problem was that he'd never learned to love people for anything other than what they could do for him. As Marcus went to bed that night, he realized that his test was revealing truths he hadn't been prepared to discover. The most shocking revelation wasn't about other people's greed. It was about his own emotional poverty. Maria's simple, genuine care was showing him what love actually looked like, and he was beginning to suspect that he'd never experienced it before because he'd never offered it to anyone else. The test would continue, but Marcus was no longer sure he wanted to be the kind of person who passed it. Chapter 9. The Board Meeting. 3 weeks into his fake illness, Marcus faced his first major professional challenge, the quarterly board meeting for Wellington Industries. As the company's founder and majority shareholder, his presence was expected, but his treatment schedule provided a perfect excuse to observe how his absence might affect company dynamics. He decided to attend the meeting but to participate minimally, claiming fatigue from his recent chemotherapy session. This would allow him to watch how board members, executives, and his business partner Richard reacted to signs that his leadership might be compromised. The meeting was held in the glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of the Wellington building, with stunning views of the city that Marcus had built his empire to dominate. As he entered the room, he noticed immediate changes in how people interacted with him. Board members who usually greeted him with firm handshakes and direct eye contact now approached more cautiously, offering gentle touches on his shoulder and speaking in softer tones. Several people commented that he looked good, which he recognized as the kind of lie people tell when someone actually looks terrible. Dr. Matthews had given him mild stimulants to counteract the fatigue-inducing medications, but Marcus was still moving more slowly and speaking more quietly than usual. To outside observers, he probably looked like a man fighting a serious illness with dignified determination. "Marcus, please sit," said board member Patricia Williams, pulling out his chair with unusual solicitude. "Can we get you anything? Water? Tea?" "I'm fine, thank you," Marcus replied, settling into his seat with deliberate care. "Let's get started. I want to keep this meeting as efficient as possible." Richard Blackstone, his longtime business partner and the company's president, took charge of the agenda with an authority that felt subtly different from their usual collaborative dynamic. In the past, Richard had always deferred to Marcus on major decisions, but today he seemed to be positioning himself as the primary leader, while treating Marcus more like an elder statesman, offering occasional wisdom. Before we dive into quarterly numbers, Richard said, I want to address something that's been on everyone's mind. Marcus has been dealing with some health challenges recently, and we want him to know that the entire board supports whatever schedule and involvement level works best for his recovery. Marcus noticed that Richard didn't specify the nature of his health challenges, which suggested that David had indeed shared information, but had been appropriately discreet about details. Still, it was clear that people knew something significant was happening. Thank you, Richard, Marcus replied. I'm optimistic about my treatment, but I appreciate the board's flexibility as I navigate this situation. As the meeting progressed, Marcus observed subtle but significant changes in group dynamics. Board members directed more questions to Richard and fewer to Marcus. When Marcus did speak, people listened with the kind of respectful attention typically reserved for someone whose opinions might soon be unavailable. Several times, colleagues asked if he was feeling all right or if he needed a break. Most tellingly, the discussion of future projects and long-term planning seemed to proceed with an assumption that Marcus's involvement might be limited going forward. Nobody said this explicitly, but the language people used suggested they were beginning to imagine the company operating without his day-to-day leadership. Marcus, said board member James Chen, given your current situation, maybe this is a good time to think about succession planning more seriously. Not because we're worried about your recovery, he added quickly, but because strong leadership transition plans are always good business practice. This was exactly the kind of comment Marcus had been expecting and dreading. His fake illness was already prompting conversations about replacing him, even among people who presumably wanted him to survive and recover. I appreciate the concern, Marcus replied carefully, but I'm not ready to discuss succession planning. Let's focus on this quarter's performance and next quarter's goals. Richard jumped in smoothly. Of course, Marcus, we're just thinking ahead, making sure the company remains stable while you focus on your health. Nobody's talking about replacing you, we're talking about supporting you. But Marcus could see the calculations happening behind everyone's eyes. Board members were already imagining how the company might run without him. His illness, fake though it was, had reminded everyone that even billionaires were mortal, and that business empires needed to survive their founders. The most revealing moment came when the board discussed a major acquisition opportunity that had emerged since their last meeting. In the past, Marcus would have been expected to lead this discussion and make the final decision. Today, the conversation proceeded as if his approval was optional rather than essential. What do you think, Marcus? Richard asked after outlining the proposal. Should we move forward with due diligence? The question was phrased as if Marcus's opinion mattered, but the tone suggested that Richard was prepared to proceed regardless of his answer. This was particularly troubling because Richard would need Marcus's approval as majority shareholder to finalize any major acquisition. Let's table this for now, Marcus said, testing how his business partner would respond. I'd like to review the proposal more carefully before making any commitments. Richard's expression flickered with something that might have been frustration before settling back into professional concern. Of course, Marcus. Take all the time you need. Though I should mention that the sellers are hoping for a quick decision. We might lose the opportunity if we wait too long. This was a classic pressure tactic, the kind of subtle manipulation that Richard had never used with Marcus before. It suggested that his business partner was already thinking about how to work around Marcus's decision-making authority, rather than simply supporting his choices. After the meeting, Richard asked to speak with Marcus privately. They walked to Marcus's office, where Richard closed the door and adopted the kind of serious expression reserved for difficult conversations. Marcus, I want you to know that I'm here to support you in whatever way you need, Richard began. If that means taking on more responsibility while you focus on your health, I'm prepared to do that. If it means making decisions quickly so you don't have to worry about every detail, I can handle that too. I appreciate the offer, Richard, but I'm not ready to delegate major decisions yet. Of course not. But Marcus, I have to ask, are you sure you're being fair to yourself and to the company? You've built something incredible here, but maybe it's time to trust other people to help carry the load. Marcus studied his business partner's face, looking for signs of genuine concern versus opportunistic positioning. Richard seemed sincere, but his suggestions all pointed in the same direction, reducing Marcus's authority and increasing his own. Richard, are you worried about the company's stability if my treatment doesn't go well? I'm worried about you, Richard replied. But yes, I'm also thinking about the company. We have a responsibility to our employees, our shareholders, our clients. If you're not operating at full capacity, which is completely understandable given what you're dealing with, then we need to make sure the business doesn't suffer. This was the conversation Marcus had been dreading and expecting. Even his closest business partner was already planning for a future without him, using his illness as justification for assuming greater control. I understand your concerns, Marcus said finally, but I'm not ready to make any major changes yet. Let's see how the next few weeks go. Richard nodded, but Marcus could see disappointment in his expression. Of course, just remember that I'm here when you're ready to talk about transitioning some responsibilities. As Richard left his office, Marcus realized that his test was revealing uncomfortable truths about every relationship in his life. Even people who claimed to support him were using his vulnerability as an opportunity to advance their own interests. But the most disturbing revelation was that their behavior might actually be reasonable. If Marcus really was dying, wouldn't responsible business partners need to plan for succession? Wouldn't loving family members need to understand their financial situation? Wasn't he asking people to ignore practical realities in favor of pure emotional support? Maybe the problem wasn't that people were responding to his illness with calculated self-interest. Maybe the problem was that he'd built a life where calculation and self-interest were the only rational responses to his mortality. Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon staring out his office window, wondering if his test was revealing other people's greed or simply the logical consequences of his own choices. Either way, he was beginning to suspect that he wouldn't like the final results of his elaborate experiment. Chapter 10. The Sun's True Colors. David's mask began to slip during his fourth visit since Marcus's fake diagnosis. The initial shock and genuine concern had given way to something more calculated, more focused on practical matters that extended beyond his father's immediate health needs. Marcus had asked David to meet him at the house on a Thursday evening, claiming he wanted to discuss some family matters, while Clarissa was at her weekly pottery class. In reality, he wanted to observe his son's behavior without Clarissa's presence potentially influencing the dynamic. David arrived with a leather portfolio and a slightly nervous energy that immediately put Marcus on alert. This wasn't the casual visit of a son checking on his sick father. This was a business meeting disguised as family time. "How are you feeling, Dad?" David asked, settling into the familiar chair in Marcus's study. "You look a little better than last week." "I have my good days and bad days," Marcus replied, which was actually true for reasons David didn't understand. "Dr. Matthews says that's normal for this stage of treatment." "Good, that's good." David seemed distracted, eager to move past pleasantries to whatever agenda had prompted this visit. "Dad, I've been doing some research into your business structure, and I think we need to talk about some potential issues." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of issues?" David opened his portfolio and pulled out several printed documents. "I've been consulting with a lawyer just to understand the implications of your illness, you understand. And it turns out there are some tax complications we should address sooner rather than later." "What lawyer?" Marcus asked sharply. "I didn't authorize you to discuss my affairs with anyone." "Dad, relax. It's Thomas Henderson, Elizabeth Henderson's son, the tax attorney. I didn't give him any details about your specific situation. I just asked some hypothetical questions about estate planning for someone in your position." The fact that David had involved the Hendersons, the same family that Clarissa was courting for museum board connections, suggested a level of coordination that made Marcus deeply uncomfortable. Were his wife and son comparing notes about his condition and their responses to it? "What did this lawyer tell you?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Well, there are several issues," David said, warming to his topic with an enthusiasm that felt inappropriate given the circumstances. "First, if your illness progresses, there could be questions about your mental capacity to make major financial decisions. We should probably establish some legal frameworks now while you're clearly competent to protect against challenges later." "Challenges from whom?" Anyone, really. Business partners, distant relatives, even government agencies if there are questions about tax filings or corporate decisions made during your illness. David leaned forward earnestly. Dad, I'm not trying to be morbid here, but we need to be realistic about potential scenarios. Marcus studied his son's face, looking for signs of genuine concern versus opportunistic planning. What exactly are you proposing? David consulted his notes, reading from what appeared to be a carefully prepared list. First, we should establish a revocable trust that gives me power of attorney for financial decisions if you become incapacitated. Second, we should clarify the succession plan for Wellington Industries to avoid any confusion about leadership transitions. Third, we should reorganize some of your assets to minimize estate tax implications. Marcus felt his blood pressure rising as he listened to his son systematically outline a plan to assume control of his empire. David, I'm not incapacitated. I'm not even close to being incapacitated. I'm undergoing treatment for a condition that has a 70% survival rate. Of course, Dad, of course, David said quickly. I'm not suggesting you're incapacitated now. I'm just trying to protect you from future complications. If the treatment doesn't go as well as we hope, or if you have a bad reaction to chemotherapy, we want to make sure nobody can challenge your wishes or take advantage of temporary confusion. The explanation sounded reasonable, but Marcus noticed that all of David's proposed protections involved giving his son significant control over decisions and assets. There were no suggestions for protections that would preserve Marcus's autonomy or ensure his wishes were respected, only arrangements that would transfer power to David. Who would be taking advantage of my confusion? Marcus asked pointedly. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, potentially anyone. Clarissa, for instance. Dad, I need to be honest with you about something. I'm concerned about her motivations during your illness. This was unexpected. Marcus had been wondering if David and Clarissa were coordinating their efforts to position themselves advantageously during his treatment. Now it seemed they might actually be working against each other. What concerns do you have about Clarissa? She's been asking a lot of questions about your business structure, your assets, your estate planning. She's meeting with financial advisors and lawyers without including you in the conversations. Dad, I think she's planning for scenarios where you don't recover. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with his fake illness. What kind of scenarios? Think about it, David said, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. Clarissa is your second wife. Under your current will, she inherits a significant portion of your estate, but she has no legal connection to Wellington Industries. If something happens to you, she could potentially force the sale of company assets to liquidate her inheritance. This possibility hadn't occurred to Marcus, but he realized David was right. Clarissa's inheritance was structured as a percentage of his total estate value, not as specific assets. If she chose to claim her inheritance in cash rather than stock holdings, it could destabilize the entire company. Furthermore, David continued, as your surviving spouse, she would have legal standing to challenge any business decisions you make during your illness. If she could argue that your judgment was compromised by medical treatments, she could essentially freeze your assets and force everything into probate. Marcus stared at his son, trying to process these implications. David, where are you getting this information? This sounds like you've been planning for my death in considerable detail. Dad, I'm trying to protect you and protect the company that you built that represents your legacy. David's voice rose with apparent passion. I've been doing research because I love you and because I don't want to see everything you've worked for destroyed by legal battles after you're gone. I'm not gone, David. I'm not even close to gone. But what if you were? David pressed. What if the treatment doesn't work? What if you have complications? Dad, you taught me to plan for contingencies in business. Why shouldn't we plan for contingencies in life? Marcus realized that his son was using his own business philosophy against him. David was framing his succession planning as prudent preparation rather than opportunistic positioning. But the effect was the same. David was asking for legal authority over Marcus's empire based on the possibility that he might die. What exactly are you asking me to do? Marcus said finally. David pulled out a set of legal documents from his portfolio. I've had Thomas Henderson draft some preliminary paperwork. Nothing final, nothing binding. Just documents that clarify your intentions and protect your interests if your condition deteriorates. Marcus took the papers and scanned them quickly, his business experience allowing him to cut through the legal language to understand the practical implications. The documents would give David power of attorney for financial decisions, establish him as successor trustee for Marcus's personal assets, and designate him as the primary heir for Wellington Industries stock holdings. Most significantly, the documents would limit Clarissa's inheritance to a fixed dollar amount rather than a percentage of the estate, and they would restrict her ability to force the liquidation of business assets. David, these documents essentially disinherit Clarissa and give you complete control over my business empire. They protect your legacy, David corrected. Dad, Clarissa has been married to you for 15 years, but I'm your son. I'm your blood. I'm the one who should carry on what you've built. Marcus heard something in his son's voice that chilled him. Not love or concern, but possessiveness. David wasn't trying to protect his father's legacy, he was trying to claim it. And what if I recover completely? Marcus asked. What if the treatment works and I live another 20 years? Then these documents never matter, David said. They're just insurance policies. But Dad, even if you recover, don't you think it's time to start transitioning some responsibilities? You're 62 years old. You've earned the right to slow down, to enjoy your wealth instead of just accumulating it. Marcus recognized this argument as the same one Richard had made during the board meeting. Everyone around him was using his fake illness as justification for encouraging him to step back from the empire he'd built. David, I need to think about this. These are major decisions that I'm not ready to make right now. Of course, take all the time you need, David said, but his tone suggested disappointment that his father wasn't immediately agreeing to sign over his life's work. Just remember that these protections become harder to implement if your condition gets worse. It's easier to establish your wishes clearly while you're healthy and thinking clearly. As David prepared to leave, he paused at the door of the study. Dad, I want you to know that I love you, and everything I'm suggesting is about protecting you and honoring what you've built. I don't want to see Clarissa or anyone else take advantage of your illness. After his son left, Marcus sat alone in his study, staring at the legal documents that would essentially transfer his empire to David, based on nothing more than the possibility that he might die from cancer. The papers were professionally drafted, legally sound, and presented as protective measures rather than wealth transfers. But Marcus could see them for what they really were. His son's attempt to use his fake illness as justification for claiming an inheritance he felt entitled to receive. The most disturbing aspect wasn't David's opportunism, it was his apparent sincerity. Marcus genuinely believed that his son thought he was acting in his father's best interests. David had convinced himself that protecting Marcus from Clarissa was more important than respecting Marcus's autonomy to make his own decisions. This rationalization allowed David to pursue his own interests while maintaining the moral high ground of family loyalty. He could claim to be protecting his father while actually positioning himself to inherit everything his father had built. Marcus realized that his test was revealing something more complex and troubling than simple greed. The people in his life weren't just interested in his money. They were convinced that they deserved his money and that their claims were more legitimate than anyone else's, including his own. David genuinely believed he had more right to Wellington Industries than Clarissa did. Clarissa probably believed she had more right to financial security than David did. Richard likely believed he had more right to control the company than either family member did. Everyone was fighting for pieces of Marcus's empire while he was still alive to defend it. They were using his fake illness as justification for their claims, but Marcus suspected they would have found other justifications if he'd remained healthy. The test was working exactly as he'd planned, but the results were more devastating than he'd anticipated. Marcus was discovering that the people who claimed to love him were actually engaged in a subtle war over his legacy, and his fake mortality had simply accelerated battles that were already being planned. As he sat alone in his study that night, Marcus realized that his greatest fear was coming true. He was surrounded by people who cared more about his death than his life, but he was also beginning to suspect that he had created this situation himself, by building relationships based on wealth and power, rather than genuine emotional connection. The question now was whether it was too late to change the system he had created, or whether his test would simply confirm that he was destined to die rich and alone. Chapter 11. The Wife's Secret Calls. Marcus's suspicions about Clarissa's mysterious phone calls intensified when he accidentally overheard one of her conversations while returning home early from a fake treatment session. He had told her he would be at the medical center until evening, but Dr. Matthews had decided to cut the session short when Marcus complained of a genuine headache brought on by the stress of maintaining his deception. As he entered their house through the side door, he heard Clarissa's voice coming from her private sitting room, speaking in urgent, hushed tones that immediately caught his attention. He paused in the hallway, telling himself he was simply waiting for her to finish her call before announcing his early return. "No, he doesn't suspect anything," Clarissa was saying. "The doctor says he's responding well to treatment, but we need to be prepared for all possibilities." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Who was she talking to, and what didn't he suspect? "I understand the timeline," Clarissa continued, "but we can't move too quickly. If he gets suspicious, it could ruin everything we've worked for." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Clarissa was clearly plotting something, and his illness, real or fake, was somehow central to her plans. "Have you spoken with Richard about the board situation?" she asked her unknown conversation partner. "Good. And what about David? Is he cooperating with the revised timeline?" Marcus felt the floor shift beneath him as he realized that Clarissa, Richard, and David might be coordinating their efforts. His wife, his son, and his business partner were apparently working together on some plan that involved his illness, his business, and a timeline that needed to be managed carefully. "No, absolutely not," Clarissa said sharply. "We stick to the original agreement. Everyone gets what we discussed, nothing more, nothing less. This isn't about greed, it's about protecting everyone's interests." Marcus strained to hear more, but Clarissa's voice dropped to an even quieter whisper. He caught fragments. Legal documents, medical evaluation, financial restructuring, and contingency planning. Then he heard footsteps approaching the sitting room door and Clarissa saying, "He's home. I have to go. We'll continue this tomorrow." Marcus quickly moved away from the door and called out loudly, "Clarissa, I'm home early. Treatment finished sooner than expected." "Coming, darling," she replied, her voice bright and cheerful, completely different from the conspiratorial tone he'd just overheard. She emerged from her sitting room with a perfect smile, moving to embrace him with what appeared to be genuine warmth and concern. "How are you feeling? You look tired." "A little worn out," Marcus replied, studying her face for any signs of the conversation he'd just overheard. "Who were you talking to?" "Oh, just Elizabeth Henderson," Clarissa said smoothly. She was asking about museum board committee assignments. You know how these social politics can be. Everyone wants to secure the best positions before the annual meeting. The lie came so easily, so naturally, that Marcus realized Clarissa was much more accomplished at deception than he'd ever suspected. She was looking directly into his eyes, her expression conveying nothing but loving concern for his well-being, while fabricating a complete fiction about her phone conversation. "Did she ask about my health?" Marcus tested. "Of course, everyone's been asking about you. I've been trying to keep details private as you requested, but people are concerned." Clarissa took his hand and led him toward the living room. "Darling, maybe we should talk about when you're ready to tell people more specifically about your condition. Some of our friends are starting to worry." Marcus allowed himself to be led to the sofa, his mind racing to process what he'd overheard. Clarissa was clearly involved in some kind of planning that involved Richard and David, but she was also maintaining her performance as a devoted wife with remarkable skill. "What kind of worries?" he asked. "Just the usual concerns when someone important in their social circle is dealing with health issues. People want to know how to help, what kind of support would be appropriate, whether they should be preparing for changes in social dynamics." Even her explanation was perfectly calibrated. Reasonable concerns that wealthy social circles might actually have, presented in a way that made her phone call seem innocent and her lies seem protective. But Marcus had heard enough of the real conversation to know that whatever Clarissa was planning went far beyond managing social concerns. She was coordinating with Richard and David on something that involved legal documents, financial restructuring, and careful timeline management. Over the following days, Marcus became hyper-aware of Clarissa's behavior, looking for additional clues about her secret planning. He noticed that she'd left the house for longer periods than usual, claiming various social obligations that she'd never mentioned before. She received more phone calls that she took in private, and she seemed to be checking her messages more frequently. Most tellingly, she began asking more specific questions about his treatment timeline and prognosis. "Marcus, when do you think Dr. Matthews will have a better sense of how well the treatment is working?" she asked over dinner one evening. "Why do you ask?" "I'm just trying to plan ahead. If the treatment is going well, maybe we could take a vacation somewhere relaxing. If you're going to need more intensive care, I want to make sure I'm available to support you." The question sounded caring, but Marcus remembered her phone conversation mentioning timelines and coordination with Richard and David. She wasn't planning vacations. She was planning something that required precise timing, based on his medical condition. "Harrison says we'll have a better assessment after 6 weeks of treatment," Marcus replied truthfully, since that was the timeline he and Dr. Matthews had established for their deception. "6 weeks," Clarissa repeated thoughtfully. "So, around the end of next month." Marcus noticed that she seemed to be calculating something, as if the 6-week timeline had significance beyond his medical prognosis. That night, after Clarissa had gone to sleep, Marcus found himself lying awake wondering how many people were plotting against him. David wanted him to sign legal documents that would transfer control of his empire. Richard was positioning himself to assume greater authority over the company, and now Clarissa was apparently coordinating with both of them on some plan that involved his illness and required careful timing. The most disturbing possibility was that all three of them were working together, using his fake cancer as an opportunity to restructure his entire life in ways that benefited them rather than him. They might be planning to have him declared mentally incompetent due to his illness, or they might be preparing to assume control of his assets if his condition deteriorated. Marcus realized that his elaborate test had revealed something far worse than simple greed or opportunism. The people closest to him weren't just interested in his death, they were actively planning for it, coordinating their efforts to ensure that his demise would benefit them as much as possible. But the cruelest irony was that their planning was based on a fiction he had created. Marcus wasn't actually dying, but his fake illness had prompted real betrayals that might destroy his relationships even after he revealed the truth. He had wanted to know who truly loved him, but his test was revealing that the people who claimed to love him were actually his enemies. They were using his vulnerability as an opportunity to advance their own interests, and they were doing it so skillfully that he might never have discovered their betrayal if he hadn't created the perfect conditions for them to reveal their true nature. Marcus fell asleep that night realizing that his test had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, and that success might cost him everything he thought he could trust about his life. Chapter 12. The Housekeeper's Wisdom. The morning after Marcus overheard Clarissa's suspicious phone call, he found Maria in the kitchen preparing his breakfast with even more care than usual. She had arranged fresh fruit in perfect patterns, brewed tea from a special blend her sister had recommended, and prepared toast cut into small, manageable pieces that would be easier for someone with a compromised appetite to eat. "Good morning, Mr. Marcus," she said warmly, studying his face with the kind of attention he'd grown to appreciate over the past few weeks. "You look troubled today. Did you not sleep well?" Marcus was struck by how easily Maria could read his emotional state. She had no training in psychology, no advanced education, no sophisticated understanding of human nature. But she possessed something that seemed increasingly rare in his life: the ability to see him as a person rather than as a collection of assets and opportunities. "I've been thinking about some family matters," Marcus replied, which was truthful enough. "Nothing for you to worry about." Maria nodded but continued studying him with concern. "Mr. Marcus, may I speak freely with you?" Marcus looked up from his breakfast, surprised by the serious tone in her voice. In 12 years of employment, Maria had never asked permission to speak freely. She was always respectful but never hesitant to express her thoughts when they related to household matters. "Of course, Maria. What's on your mind?" She sat down across from him at the kitchen table, something she'd also never done before. Her expression was grave, as if she were preparing to share something important and difficult. "Mr. Marcus, I know is not my place to comment on family business, but I am worried about you. Not just about your sickness, about other things." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What kind of other things? Maria hesitated for a moment, clearly struggling with whether to cross professional boundaries. I see things, Mr. Marcus. I hear things. It's not my intention to spy, but when you work in someone's house for 12 years, you notice changes. What changes have you noticed? Mrs. Clarissa, she is making many phone calls that she doesn't want you to hear. She speaks in whispers, she closes doors, she goes to other rooms when her phone rings. This started after you told her about your sickness. Marcus tried to keep his expression neutral, but Maria's observation confirmed his own suspicions about his wife's behavior. And Mr. David, Maria continued, he comes to visit more now, but he brings papers, he asks questions about business things. Before your sickness, he never asked about your work. Now he wants to know about company things, about money things. Marcus realized that Maria's position in the household gave her a unique perspective on family dynamics. She was present but invisible, trusted but ignored, which allowed her to observe behaviors that family members might hide from each other. Maria, why are you telling me this? Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. Because I think people are not caring for you the way they should. When someone is sick, family should think about making them comfortable, making them happy, helping them feel loved. But I see people thinking about other things, about papers, about money, about what happens if you don't get better. This observation hit Marcus harder than any business betrayal or financial manipulation could have. Maria had identified the fundamental problem with how people were responding to his illness. They weren't focusing on his well-being. They were focusing on the implications of his mortality. But Mr. Marcus, Maria continued, I also need to tell you something else. I know you are not as sick as you pretend to be. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. What do you mean? You think I don't notice, but I notice everything. When you come home from treatment, you are tired. Yes, but not the right kind of tired. When my brother had cancer treatment, he was sick in his stomach. He could not eat certain foods. He slept different. You are tired like someone who is worried, not like someone who is fighting cancer. Marcus stared at Maria, realizing that the person who knew him best in his own household was the employee he'd barely noticed for 12 years. She had seen through his deception not because she was suspicious, but because she cared enough to pay attention to details that everyone else missed. Also, Maria added, your medicine bottles in the bathroom? I clean the bathroom every day. The bottles never get empty. If you were taking strong cancer medicine, the bottles would need refilling. Marcus felt exposed and vulnerable in a way he'd never experienced. His elaborate deception, carefully crafted with medical expertise and legal documentation, had been unraveled by a housekeeper who simply paid attention to the small details of daily life. Maria, Is okay, Mr. Marcus, she interrupted gently. I understand why you pretend to be sick. You want to see who loves you for real, not just who loves your money. This is a smart idea, but also a dangerous idea. Marcus was amazed by her immediate understanding of his motivations. She had identified his intentions without judgment, recognizing both the wisdom and the risk in his approach. You think I'm wrong to test people this way? Maria considered the question carefully. I think you are a lonely man who built walls around his heart with money, and now you want to know if anyone can climb those walls to reach the real you. But Mr. Marcus, when you test people with lies, you teach them that lies are acceptable. When you pretend to be dying to see who cares about you, you make it hard for people to trust you when you are really sick someday. Her insight was profound and troubling. Marcus had been so focused on testing other people's honesty that he hadn't considered how his own dishonesty might damage his relationships permanently. What do you think I should do? I think you should stop pretending to be sick, Maria said firmly. And I think you should talk to your family honestly about why you feel unloved. Maybe they don't know how to show love in ways you understand. Maybe you don't know how to receive love when people offer it. Marcus thought about David's genuine concern mixed with financial planning, Clarissa's fierce devotion mixed with practical considerations, and Richard's professional support mixed with business positioning. Maybe Maria was right. Maybe these people were trying to show love in ways that made sense to them. But he was so focused on their ulterior motives that he couldn't recognize their genuine care. But Maria, what if I tell them the truth and they never forgive me for lying? Then you learn something important about them, she replied. But Mr. Marcus, if you keep lying, you never give them chance to show real love. You only give them chance to show love to fake sick person. This observation struck Marcus as the most insightful thing anyone had said to him in years. He had been testing people's love for a fictional version of himself, a vulnerable, dying man who needed care and protection. But their responses to this fiction might have no relationship to how they would love the real Marcus in real circumstances. There's something else, Maria added. I think Mrs. Clarissa and Mr. David, they know you are not really sick. Not like I know, but something feels wrong to them. This is why they make plans, why they talk in whispers. They are not planning to hurt you, they are trying to figure out what you are really doing. This possibility had never occurred to Marcus. He'd assumed that Clarissa and David's suspicious behavior meant they were plotting against him, but maybe they were actually trying to understand his behavior, which genuinely didn't make sense if viewed as the actions of someone fighting cancer. You think they're suspicious of my illness? I think they love you, but they are confused by you, Maria said. When someone acts like they are dying but doesn't seem really sick, family gets scared. Not scared that person will die, scared that person is lying. And when someone lies about being sick, family thinks maybe they are lying about other things too. Marcus realized that his test might have created exactly the opposite effect of what he'd intended. Instead of revealing who truly loved him, he might have damaged people's trust in him so severely that they felt compelled to protect themselves through the very planning and coordination he was interpreting as betrayal. Maria, you've given me a lot to think about, but I need to ask you, are you going to tell anyone what you suspect about my illness? She shook her head firmly. It is not my place to tell family secrets. But Mr. Marcus, I hope you will tell them yourself, before their confusion turns into something worse. As Maria returned to her work, Marcus sat at the kitchen table contemplating the most profound conversation he'd had since conceiving his elaborate test. The woman he'd barely noticed for 12 years had seen through his deception, understood his motivations, identified the flaws in his approach, and offered wisdom that cut straight to the heart of his dilemma. She had also shown him what genuine love looked like, caring enough to pay attention, being brave enough to speak difficult truths, and offering guidance without expecting anything in return. Marcus realized that while he'd been testing everyone else's capacity for love, Maria had been demonstrating it quietly and consistently, asking for nothing except the opportunity to care for someone who needed care. The irony was devastating. The most genuine love in his life was coming from the person he'd never thought to include in his test, while the people he was testing were responding with confusion and protective planning that he was misinterpreting as betrayal. Marcus spent the rest of the morning wondering if his elaborate deception had revealed the truth about his relationships or destroyed any possibility of discovering what that truth might have been. Chapter 13. The Moment of Truth. The Confrontation. Marcus had been dreading arrived unexpectedly on a Tuesday afternoon when David, Clarissa, and Richard appeared at his office without warning. Their coordinated arrival confirmed his worst suspicions about their collaboration, but their expressions suggested this wasn't the hostile takeover he'd been anticipating. Jennifer had tried to warn him, but the three of them had insisted the meeting was urgent and couldn't wait for a scheduled appointment. They filed into his office with the grim determination of people preparing to have a difficult but necessary conversation. "Marcus, we need to talk," Clarissa said, her voice carrying an authority he'd rarely heard from her. "All of us together, right now." David closed the office door and took a position near the window, while Richard sat across from Marcus's desk. Clarissa remained standing, her posture suggesting she was prepared to lead this intervention. "What's this about?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. "It's about your illness," David said. "Dad, we know something isn't right about your diagnosis and treatment." Marcus felt his carefully constructed deception crumbling around him, but he wasn't ready to surrender without testing how much they actually knew. "I don't understand what you mean." "Marcus," Richard interjected, "I've been doing some research into pancreatic cancer treatment protocols. The experimental therapy that Dr. Matthews claims you're receiving doesn't exist. I called Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and 3 other major cancer centers. None of them have heard of the specific treatment regimen he described." Clarissa stepped forward, her expression mixing concern with frustration. "And, darling, I consulted with 2 oncologists about your symptoms and progress. They both said that someone undergoing the aggressive chemotherapy you're supposedly receiving should be showing much more severe side effects by now. David pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a series of photographs. Dad, I've been documenting your appearance over the past month. Someone receiving intensive cancer treatment should be losing more weight, showing more fatigue, experiencing more obvious physical changes. You look tired and stressed, but you don't look like someone fighting for their life. Marcus stared at the evidence they'd assembled against him, realizing that his family and business partner had been conducting their own investigation while he thought he was testing them. Their suspicious behavior hadn't been evidence of betrayal. It had been evidence of detective work. "So, what are you suggesting?" Marcus asked, still not ready to confess. "We think you're faking your cancer," Clarissa said bluntly. "We don't know why, but we think you're pretending to be sick for some reason that you haven't shared with us." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Marcus looked at the three people who were supposed to be closest to him, seeing expressions that mixed hurt, confusion, and determination. "And what if I am?" he asked, abandoning his denials. "What would that mean to you?" "It would mean you've been lying to us for weeks," David said, his voice tight with emotion. "It would mean you've been manipulating our feelings, making us worry about losing you, putting us through hell for no reason we can understand." Richard leaned forward in his chair. "Marcus, if you're not actually sick, then all the business planning we've been doing, all the succession discussions, all the legal preparations, none of it was necessary. You've had us scrambling to protect your company and your family based on a medical crisis that doesn't exist." Clarissa sat down heavily in the chair beside Richard, her composed facade finally cracking. "Marcus, do you have any idea what these past weeks have been like for me? Thinking I was about to lose my husband, trying to be strong while falling apart inside, researching treatments and specialists and support groups? I've been planning for a future without you. And if you're not actually sick..." Marcus saw tears in his wife's eyes and realized that her mysterious phone calls and secretive planning might have had nothing to do with greed or opportunism. She might have been trying to manage her own grief and fear while protecting him from additional stress. "The phone calls," Marcus said quietly. "Who were you really talking to?" Clarissa looked surprised by the question. "My therapist, mostly, and Dr. Patricia Williams, you remember, she's a psychologist who specializes in helping families cope with terminal illness. And sometimes Elizabeth Henderson, because her husband went through cancer treatment 2 years ago." Marcus felt the foundation of his suspicions shifting beneath him. "You were getting professional help to cope with my illness?" "Of course I was getting help," Clarissa said, her voice rising with frustration. "Marcus, I was watching the man I love slowly dying. I needed to learn how to support you without falling apart myself. I needed to understand what to expect, how to manage my own emotions, how to help you through treatment." David stepped away from the window, his expression angry but also hurt. "Dad, the legal documents I brought you, I wasn't trying to steal your company. I was trying to protect it from exactly the kind of chaos that happens when someone dies without clear succession planning. I've seen what happens to family businesses when the founder dies unexpectedly. I was trying to prevent that." "And the meetings with Thomas Henderson?" Marcus asked. "We're about protecting you from potential challenges to your estate," David replied. "Dad, when someone has a terminal illness, sometimes distant relatives or business associates try to challenge their final decisions, claiming the illness affected their judgment. I was trying to establish legal frameworks that would protect your wishes." Richard nodded in agreement. "Marcus, all the business planning we've been doing, it wasn't about pushing you out or taking control. It was about making sure the company could survive if something happened to you. You built something incredible, and we were trying to make sure it wouldn't collapse if you couldn't lead it anymore." Marcus looked at the three people sitting in his office, realizing that he had misinterpreted almost everything about their behavior over the past month. Their secretive planning hadn't been evidence of betrayal. It had been evidence of love, expressed through practical preparation for devastating loss. "So the coordination between all of you was us trying to help each other help you," Clarissa finished. "Marcus, we were all struggling with how to support you while dealing with our own fear and grief. We shared information because we wanted to make sure you were getting the best possible care and that all the practical details were handled so you could focus on getting better." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus realized that his elaborate test had revealed something, but not what he'd expected to discover. Instead of exposing greed and opportunism, he'd uncovered the painful truth that the people who loved him had been trying to care for him in ways he didn't recognize or appreciate. "Why did you think I was faking?" Marcus asked finally. David exchanged glances with Clarissa and Richard. "Because the person we've been watching for the past month doesn't match someone who's actually fighting cancer. You've been tired and stressed, but you haven't been sick. You've been emotionally distant, but you haven't been physically deteriorating. And because," Clarissa added quietly, "you've been watching us instead of leaning on us. Someone who's actually facing death usually wants more support, not less. They want family closer, not further away. You've been observing our reactions rather than sharing your fears." Marcus felt the full weight of his deception crashing down on him. He had been so focused on testing their love that he'd forgotten to accept it. He'd been so suspicious of their motives that he'd missed their genuine efforts to care for him. "Marcus," Richard said gently, "whatever this has been about, whatever you were trying to accomplish, we need to know the truth now, because we can't keep living with this uncertainty." Marcus looked at the three people who had just dismantled his elaborate deception with careful investigation and loving concern. They had caught him in his lie not because they were plotting against him, but because they cared enough to pay attention to details that didn't make sense. The moment of truth had arrived, and Marcus realized that the test had revealed exactly what he'd wanted to know, but the results were the opposite of what he'd feared to discover. Chapter 14. The Confession. Marcus stood up from his desk and walked to the window, looking out at the city he'd conquered while building his empire. For several long moments, the only sound in the office was the muted hum of traffic 42 floors below. When he finally turned back to face David, Clarissa, and Richard, his expression carried the weight of someone preparing to confess a crime. "You're right," he said simply. "I'm not sick. I don't have cancer. I've been faking the entire illness." The words hit the room like a physical force. Clarissa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. David's face went pale, then flushed with anger. Richard just stared, as if he couldn't quite process what he'd just heard. "Dr. Matthews has been helping me," Marcus continued. "The medical records, the test results, the treatment sessions. All of it was fabricated. I've been lying to everyone for the past month." "Why?" David asked, his voice barely controlled. "Dad, why would you do something like this?" Marcus returned to his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 62 years. "Because I needed to know who really loved me. I needed to know who cared about Marcus, the man, versus Marcus, the bank account." Clarissa stood up abruptly, her face cycling through shock, hurt, and rage. "You needed to know who loved you? So you decided to torture the people who care about you most? Marcus, do you have any idea what you've put us through?" "I was watching how you reacted," Marcus began. "You were watching us grieve," David interrupted, his voice rising. "Dad, I spent weeks thinking I was about to lose my father. I've been having nightmares about your funeral. I've been trying to figure out how to tell my future children about the grandfather they'll never meet." Richard shook his head in disbelief. "Marcus, we've restructured half the company based on your illness. We've canceled major projects, postponed acquisitions, reassigned responsibilities. The board thinks you're dying." "And I've been seeing a therapist twice a week," Clarissa added, tears streaming down her face. "I've been learning how to be a widow, Marcus. I've been planning for a life without you, trying to figure out how to honor your memory, how to carry on your philanthropic work, how to manage grief I've never experienced before." Marcus felt each accusation like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on testing their motives that he'd never fully considered the emotional cost of his deception. "I thought you were all planning to take advantage of my illness." "We were planning to take care of you," David shouted. "We were planning to help you through the most difficult experience of your life. And you've been sitting there like some kind of sick puppet master, pulling our strings and judging our responses." Clarissa wiped her eyes, her expression hardening. "Marcus, the phone calls you've been suspicious about. I was talking to grief counselors, trying to understand how to support a terminally ill spouse. The meetings with financial advisors, I was trying to make sure I could handle our affairs if you became too sick to manage them yourself." "The legal documents," David added, were designed to protect your wishes if your illness progressed to the point where you couldn't make decisions anymore. I wasn't trying to steal your company. I was trying to make sure it survived according to your vision." Richard stood up, his professional composure cracking. "Marcus, I've been losing sleep for weeks trying to figure out how to keep your life's work intact after you're gone. I've been planning a memorial service for God's sake. I've been writing a eulogy for someone who isn't actually dying." The room fell silent except for the sound of Clarissa's quiet crying. Marcus looked at the three people he'd subjected to his elaborate test, seeing the genuine pain and betrayal in their faces. They weren't angry because they'd been caught plotting against him. They were angry because they'd been manipulated while trying to love him. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. I was convinced that everyone around me only cared about my money. I wanted to see who would still love me when I was vulnerable." "We were showing you that love," Clarissa said through her tears. "We were showing you exactly the kind of love you said you wanted to see. But you were so busy looking for ulterior motives that you couldn't recognize genuine care when it was right in front of you." David sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair. "Dad, did it ever occur to you that maybe the reason people in your life think about practical matters is because you've trained us to? You've spent your entire adult life being the person who solves problems, who manages crises, who takes care of everyone else. When you got sick, we tried to take care of you the same way you've always taken care of us." This observation hit Marcus harder than any accusation of betrayal could have. He realized that David was right. He had created a family dynamic where love was expressed through practical support, financial security, and problem solving. Now he was angry that people were showing love in the language he'd taught them to speak. "Marcus," Richard said quietly, "when you announced your illness, my first thought wasn't about the company or succession planning. My first thought was that I was losing my closest friend. But then I realized that the best way I could honor our friendship was to make sure everything you'd built would survive and thrive. That's how I show love, by protecting what matters to the people I care about." Clarissa looked directly at Marcus, her eyes red but her voice steady. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Was any part of you hoping we would fail your test? Were you looking for reasons to justify cutting us out of your life?" The question pierced straight to the heart of Marcus's deepest fears and motivations. He sat in silence for a long moment, forced to confront the possibility that his test had been designed not to discover love, but to confirm his suspicions that love didn't exist. "Maybe," he admitted finally. "Maybe I was so convinced that I was unlovable that I created a test designed to prove it." "Marcus," David said, his anger giving way to something that looked like sadness. "You're not unlovable, but you might be unreachable. You've built so many walls around yourself that even when people climb over them to care for you, you assume they must have ulterior motives." Clarissa wiped her eyes and looked at her husband with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. "The cruelest part of this, Marcus, is that your fake illness revealed exactly what you said you wanted to see. We did love you when you were vulnerable. We did care for you when you couldn't care for yourself. We did put your needs above our own interests. But you were so convinced we were lying that you couldn't see we were telling the truth." Richard nodded in agreement. "Marcus, the past month has shown me that our friendship means more to me than our business partnership. When I thought you were dying, I didn't think about profit margins or market share. I thought about losing someone who's been like a brother to me for 20 years. Marcus felt tears he hadn't shed in decades beginning to well up in his eyes. His elaborate test had worked exactly as intended, but the results were the opposite of what he'd expected to find. The people in his life did love him genuinely, but his deception had potentially destroyed any possibility of accepting that love. "Can you forgive me?" he asked, his voice breaking. The question hung in the air like a prayer offered without confidence in its reception. David, Clarissa, and Richard looked at each other, and Marcus realized they were probably wondering the same thing, whether they could trust someone who had manipulated their emotions so completely. "Marcus," Clarissa said finally, "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I know I can't forget what these past weeks have shown me about our marriage. If you needed to test my love, it means you never believed in it in the first place." David nodded sadly. "Dad, I understand why you did this, but I don't understand how you could watch me suffer and not stop the test. That tells me something about who you are that I'm going to have to think about. Richard was the most direct. Marcus, this friendship meant everything to me, but I don't know if I can trust you anymore. If you were willing to lie about cancer, what else might you lie about? As the three people Marcus cared about most prepared to leave his office, he realized that his test had achieved the ultimate irony. In trying to discover who truly loved him, he had taught the people who loved him that he was incapable of accepting their love. The test was over, but Marcus was beginning to suspect that the real consequences were just beginning. Chapter 15. The Reckoning. The aftermath of Marcus's confession unfolded over the following weeks like a slow-motion avalanche, destroying relationships and revealing truths that his elaborate deception had never been designed to uncover. The immediate crisis wasn't about who loved him. It was about whether anyone could trust him again. Dr. Matthews was the first casualty. 3 days after the confrontation in Marcus's office, the medical board received an anonymous complaint about a physician who had allegedly participated in insurance fraud by fabricating a patient's medical records. Though Marcus had never billed any insurance company for his fake treatments, the complaint triggered an investigation that could destroy Dr. Matthews' career. "I should have known this would happen," Dr. Matthews said when he called Marcus to inform him about the investigation. "Marcus, I violated my oath to help you with this scheme. Even if no money changed hands illegally, I falsified medical documents and participated in a deception that caused psychological harm to your family." Marcus felt sick knowing that his oldest friend was facing professional destruction because of his selfish experiment. "Harrison, I'll confess to the medical board. I'll tell them I coerced you, that you tried to talk me out of it. That won't help, and it's not entirely true. I made my own choice to participate in your test, and now I have to face the consequences." Dr. Matthews paused, his voice heavy with regret. "Marcus, I want you to understand something. In 30 years of practicing medicine, I've never seen anything more destructive than watching you manipulate people who genuinely loved you. Your test didn't reveal their greed. It revealed your inability to accept love when it's offered freely." The conversation ended with Marcus understanding that he'd lost not just a doctor, but the friend who had known him longest and accepted him most completely. The professional consequences spread quickly through Marcus's business empire. When Richard called an emergency board meeting to explain that Marcus's illness had been fabricated, the reaction was swift and brutal. 3 board members resigned immediately, claiming they could no longer trust Marcus's judgment. 2 major clients canceled contracts, citing concerns about the CEO's mental stability. The company's stock price dropped 12% in a single day as news of the deception leaked to financial media. "Marcus, you've created a crisis of confidence that could take years to recover from," Richard explained during their last conversation as business partners. "The board is demanding your resignation as CEO. They're willing to let you retain your stock holdings, but they want you removed from any operational authority." "And what do you think I should do?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew Richard's answer. "I think you should step down voluntarily and get professional help. Marcus, what you did to your family was cruel, but what you did to our business was insane. You put hundreds of jobs at risk because you wanted to test whether people loved you for your money. That's not the behavior of someone who should be making decisions that affect other people's livelihoods." Marcus realized that Richard was right. His personal crisis had become a professional disaster that extended far beyond his own relationships. Employees who had devoted their careers to building Wellington Industries now faced uncertainty because their founder had chosen to fake a terminal illness. But the deepest pain came from watching how his deception affected his family. David hadn't spoken to him since the confrontation, communicating only through lawyers who were now handling the dissolution of Marcus's estate planning arrangements. The legal documents David had prepared to protect his father's wishes were being shredded, replaced with new arrangements that reflected the reality that David no longer trusted his father's judgment. Clarissa's response was more complex and somehow more devastating. She didn't leave immediately, but she moved into the guest bedroom and began what she called a period of evaluation. She attended therapy sessions now focusing on rebuilding trust rather than managing grief, and spoke to Marcus only when necessary for practical household matters. "I need you to understand something," she said during one of their few conversations. "When I thought you were dying, I fell in love with you all over again. I remembered why I married you, why I chose to build a life with you. I was prepared to spend whatever time we had left showing you that love." Marcus felt hope at these words, but Clarissa wasn't finished. "But now I know that while I was falling in love with you again, you were conducting an experiment on me. You were testing my emotions, judging my reactions, evaluating my worthiness to be your wife. Marcus, that's not marriage. That's psychological manipulation." The most unexpected consequence came from Maria, whose wisdom had ultimately exposed the flaws in Marcus's entire approach. Rather than feeling vindicated for seeing through his deception, she seemed profoundly sad about the destruction it had caused. "Mr. Marcus," she said one morning as she prepared what might be one of her last breakfasts in his house, "I understand why you needed to know who loved you. But love is not something you can test like a science experiment. Love is something you build with trust, day by day, year by year." "Are you leaving too, Maria?" Marcus asked, dreading her answer. "I don't know yet," she replied honestly. "I love this family, but this is not a healthy family anymore. Mrs. Clarissa is heartbroken, Mr. David is angry, and you are alone even when people are trying to love you. Maybe sometimes it's better to start over than to try to fix something that is too broken." Her words carried the weight of someone who had observed his family's dynamics for 12 years and had seen how his test had shattered relationships that might never heal. As Marcus sat alone in his study that night, surrounded by the artifacts of his success but isolated from everyone who had tried to share that success with him, he realized that his test had revealed a truth more devastating than any he'd prepared himself to discover. The people in his life had genuinely loved him, but his inability to trust that love had made him unworthy of receiving it. His wealth hadn't corrupted their affections. His suspicion had corrupted his own capacity for connection. He had become the richest and loneliest man in the world, not because people loved his money more than him, but because he had confused love with perfect selflessness and had rejected every imperfect expression of genuine care. The test was over, but Marcus was beginning to understand that the real experiment was just beginning, learning whether someone who had manipulated love could ever be trusted with it again. Chapter 16. The Long Road. Back 6 months after his confession, Marcus sat in Dr. Amanda Chen's therapy office, struggling to articulate insights that felt both profound and painfully obvious. Dr. Chen specialized in treating wealthy individuals who had become isolated by their success, and she had been recommended by Dr. Matthews during one of their final conversations. "Marcus, you've told me about your test and its aftermath," Dr. Chen said, "but I want to explore something deeper. What did you think love was supposed to look like?" Marcus considered the question, realizing he'd never seriously examined his expectations about how love should be expressed. "I suppose I thought love meant putting someone's needs above your own interests completely. I thought if someone really loved me, they wouldn't think about money or practical matters at all." "And where did you learn that definition of love?" Marcus thought back through his life, trying to identify the sources of his beliefs about relationships. "I guess I never really learned it anywhere. I just assumed that genuine love meant total selflessness." "Marcus, that's not love. That's worship. And worship isn't sustainable in human relationships because humans have needs and limitations and practical concerns that don't disappear just because they love someone." Dr. Chen's observation forced Marcus to reconsider everything about his test. He'd been evaluating people's love based on an impossible standard that no real human could meet consistently. "The people in your life were showing you love," Dr. Chen continued, "but they were showing you human love. They cared about your well-being, but they also had to consider how your illness would affect their own lives. That's not selfish, that's realistic." Marcus had been attending therapy twice a week since stepping down as CEO of Wellington Industries. The company was thriving under Richard's leadership, which had been both a relief and another blow to Marcus's ego. Apparently, his business empire didn't need him as much as he'd thought, but the professional consequences of his deception had been less devastating than the personal ones. David still wasn't speaking to him, communicating only through holiday cards and brief emails about practical matters. Clarissa had moved out 3 months ago, not to pursue divorce immediately, but to create space for individual healing and reflection. "I need to figure out who I am when I'm not being Marcus Wellington's wife," she'd explained. "For 15 years, my identity has been built around supporting your success and managing your social obligations. I need to discover who Clarissa is when she's not performing that role. The separation had been conducted with characteristic dignity and mutual respect, but it left Marcus rattling around in a house that felt like a museum of his former life. Maria had ultimately decided to stay, but their relationship had evolved into something more honest and complex. "Mr. Marcus," she'd said after Clarissa moved out, "I stay because I think you are a good man who made terrible mistake. But I stay as friend now, not just as employee, and friend tells you truth even when truth hurts." Maria's friendship had become one of the few bright spots in Marcus's new reality. She forced him to do his own laundry, cook his own meals occasionally, and generally learn how to live like a human being, rather than like a wealthy icon who had people to handle all of life's mundane requirements. "You lived so long having other people take care of everything," she observed one day as Marcus burned toast for the third time in a week, "that you forgot how to take care of yourself. How can you take care of other people if you don't know how to be a human person?" Dr. Chen had made similar observations during their therapy sessions. "Marcus, your wealth allowed you to avoid many of the ordinary human experiences that teach people how to love and be loved. You've never had to depend on anyone, never had to ask for help with basic needs, never had to navigate relationships where you weren't the one with all the power." This insight had led to one of Marcus's most difficult realizations. His test hadn't just revealed other people's motivations, it had exposed his own complete ignorance about how healthy relationships actually functioned. "I think I've been confusing love with dependency," Marcus told Dr. Chen during one session. "I wanted people to love me in ways that would make me feel needed and important, rather than ways that would actually make me feel loved." "What would actually make you feel loved?" Dr. Chen asked. Marcus struggled with this question for several sessions before beginning to develop an answer. "I think I'd feel loved if someone chose to spend time with me, even when they didn't need anything from me. If someone asked about my day because they were actually interested, not because they were being polite. If someone trusted me enough to tell me about their problems instead of always expecting me to solve their problems." Dr. Chen nodded. "Marcus, the people in your life may have been trying to offer you exactly those things, but you were so focused on their practical concerns that you couldn't see their emotional offerings." This possibility haunted Marcus as he began the slow work of rebuilding his understanding of relationships. He started reaching out to old friends, not business associates, but people he'd known before his wealth became the defining characteristic of his identity. The most surprising response came from his college roommate, Tom Bradley, who was now a high school teacher in Vermont. Marcus called him on a whim, expecting polite conversation and potential awkwardness after decades of minimal contact. "Marcus Wellington," Tom said when he answered the phone. "I was wondering when you'd finally call." "You were expecting me to call? I've been reading about you in the business news for years, and you always seem to be getting richer and more isolated. I figured eventually you'd reach out to someone who knew you before you became Marcus Wellington, billionaire." Tom's directness was refreshing and terrifying. They talked for 2 hours, with Tom asking questions about Marcus's life that no one had asked in years. Was he happy? Did he have hobbies? What did he do for fun? When was the last time he'd laughed until his stomach hurt? "Marcus, you always were an overthinker," Tom said toward the end of their conversation. "Even in college, you'd analyze people's motivations until you talked yourself out of perfectly good friendships. Sounds like you're still doing that, but now you've got enough money to make it really destructive." The observation stung because it was accurate. Marcus realized that his tendency to question other people's motivations predated his wealth by decades. His money had simply amplified personality traits that had always made relationships difficult for him. But Tom's friendship also offered hope. Here was someone who had known Marcus before he had any money, who had liked him despite his overthinking tendencies, and who was willing to rebuild their connection based on shared history rather than current circumstances. "You know what you need?" Tom said during their third conversation. "You need to do something that matters to someone else. Something where you can't solve the problem by writing a check." This suggestion led Marcus to volunteer at a literacy program that Maria had told him about. 3 days a week, he spent 2 hours helping adults learn to read, working with people who had no idea who he was and didn't care about his business success. The work was humbling and rewarding in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. His students appreciated his patience and encouragement, but they also challenged him to communicate clearly and to understand perspectives very different from his own. "Mr. Marcus," said Elena, a 45-year-old immigrant who was learning to read English, "you are a good teacher because you don't make me feel stupid. You make me feel like I can learn." These simple words of appreciation moved Marcus more than any business award or social recognition he'd ever received. Elena's gratitude was pure and uncomplicated, offered because he was helping her achieve something she valued, not because she wanted anything else from him. Working with the literacy program also introduced Marcus to other volunteers who became casual friends. They were teachers, retirees, college students, and professionals who donated their time because they believed in education and community service. None of them knew about his wealth, and their friendships developed based on shared work and mutual respect. For the first time in decades, Marcus was building relationships where he wasn't the richest, most powerful, or most important person in the room. The experience was both liberating and educational, showing him how friendships could develop organically when they weren't complicated by financial dynamics. As his first year of therapy drew to a close, Marcus found himself slowly building a new life that was smaller in scope, but richer in genuine human connection. He was learning to cook, to clean, to manage his own schedule, and to ask for help when he needed it. But the question that haunted him was whether the people he'd hurt with his elaborate test could ever trust him enough to be part of this new version of his life. The road back to their love would require more than personal growth and therapeutic insights. It would require him to prove that he had become someone worthy of the love he'd tested so destructively. Epilogue. What love actually looks like. 2 years after his confession, Marcus stood in the kitchen of his much smaller home, preparing dinner for guests who would arrive without fanfare or ulterior motives. He'd sold the mansion and most of his possessions, keeping only what he needed for a comfortable but modest lifestyle. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock, and Marcus opened it to find Tom Bradley holding a bottle of wine and grinning with the same easy warmth he'd shown 30 years ago in their college dormitory. "You actually learned to cook," Tom observed, following the scent of garlic and herbs toward the kitchen. Maria wasn't kidding when she said you'd become almost human. Maria emerged from the living room where she'd been arranging flowers, a weekly ritual they developed to mark the passage of ordinary time. She'd transitioned from employee to friend to something like family, and her presence in Marcus's life provided the continuity and wisdom he'd never appreciated when he thought he was too important to need either. "The food smells good," she said, "but remember not to overcook the vegetables like last time." Elena arrived a few minutes later with her 15-year-old daughter Sophia, who was now reading at a college level thanks to the literacy program that had become the center of Marcus's volunteer work. Elena had become one of his closest friends, and her daughter had started calling him Uncle Marcus, with the casual affection of someone who had never known him as anyone other than the patient man who helped her mother learn to read. "Mr. Marcus," Sophia said, immediately heading for the piano that dominated his living room. "I learned a new song this week. Can I play it for you after dinner?" These dinner parties had become monthly traditions, gatherings of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company without complicated agendas or social obligations. The conversations ranged from Sophia's school achievements to Tom's teaching adventures to Elena's progress in her nursing program to Maria's grandchildren's latest accomplishments. As they sat around the table Marcus had built himself, another skill he'd learned in his quest to become more self-sufficient, he reflected on how different this felt from the elaborate dinner parties he'd once hosted. There were no business deals being negotiated, no charitable donations being solicited, no social hierarchies being navigated. Just friends sharing food and stories and the comfortable intimacy of people who trusted each other. The phone rang during dessert and Marcus almost didn't answer it until he saw Dr. Matthews' name on the caller ID. His old friend had survived the medical board investigation with a formal reprimand, but had ultimately kept his license to practice. Their friendship had been slow to heal, but it was gradually rebuilding on more honest foundations. "Marcus, I'm calling with news that I thought you should hear directly," Dr. Matthews said. "David called me this afternoon. He wants to arrange a meeting with you." Marcus felt his heart rate spike at the mention of his son's name. They hadn't spoken in 2 years, though Marcus had continued sending birthday cards and occasional letters that were never answered. "What kind of meeting?" Marcus asked, stepping away from the dinner table to take the call privately. He didn't give me details, but he sounded different. Less angry, more curious, I suppose. He asked about your health, your living situation, whether you were seeing anyone professionally. I think he's been thinking about reaching out for a while. After hanging up, Marcus returned to his guests, who had noticed his absence but didn't pry into his personal business. This was another aspect of these friendships that he treasured. People cared about his well-being without needing to know every detail of his life. The following week, Marcus sat in a coffee shop downtown, waiting for David with a nervousness he hadn't experienced since his teenage years. When his son walked through the door, Marcus was struck by how much older he looked, not just physically, but emotionally. David had the bearing of someone who had faced difficult truths and emerged with hard-won wisdom. "Hello, Dad," David said, sitting across from Marcus with careful formality. "Hello, David. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." They ordered coffee and sat in silence for several minutes, both trying to figure out how to bridge 2 years of hurt and disappointment. "I've been in therapy," David said finally. "Individual therapy and also some sessions with Mom to work through the divorce aftermath that had nothing to do with your illness deception." Marcus nodded, not wanting to interrupt or guide the conversation in any direction. "Dr. Peters helped me understand something about our relationship that I'd never recognized before," David continued. "She helped me see that I've been angry at you for most of my adult life, but not for the reasons I thought." "What reasons?" David looked out the window, gathering his thoughts. "I was angry because you never needed me. You never asked for my help, my advice, my support. You made me feel like I was irrelevant to your life except as someone to provide for and worry about." This observation hit Marcus like a physical blow because he recognized its truth immediately. He'd spent David's entire life trying to be the perfect provider and protector, never allowing his son to see his vulnerabilities or to contribute meaningfully to his well-being. "When you got sick, when I thought you got sick, I was actually relieved," David continued. "Finally, you needed me. Finally, I could be useful to you instead of just being your responsibility. That's why I threw myself into the legal planning and business coordination. It wasn't about money, Dad. It was about finally having a role in your life that mattered." Marcus felt tears welling up as he understood the depth of pain his self-sufficiency had cost his son. "David, I thought I was being a good father by not burdening you with my problems. But Dad, sharing problems is how people build relationships. You never gave me the chance to support you, to advise you, to be your partner in facing life's challenges. You kept me at a distance while claiming you were protecting me." They talked for 2 hours, with David explaining how Marcus's deception had forced him to confront his own relationship patterns and his tendency to seek approval through usefulness rather than authenticity. "I'm not ready to have a normal father-son relationship yet," David said as they prepared to leave. "But I'm willing to try building something new, something more honest than what we had before." Marcus felt hope for the first time in months. What would that look like? Maybe it starts with you telling me about your actual life instead of just asking about mine. Maybe it includes you asking for my help with things occasionally. Maybe it means we both stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be real. A month later, Clarissa called Marcus directly for the first time since their separation. Her voice was warm but cautious, carrying the tone of someone who had done significant emotional work but remained unsure about the future. "Marcus, I'd like to have dinner with you. Somewhere public, nothing romantic. Just a conversation between two people who used to be married." They met at a restaurant they'd never been to before. Neutral territory that wasn't loaded with memories of their previous life together. Clarissa looked beautiful but different. More confident, more self-possessed, as if she'd discovered parts of herself that had been dormant during their marriage. "I've been taking art classes," she said, "and volunteer coordinating for a women's shelter. I'm discovering that I actually have interests and talents that have nothing to do with being someone's wife." Marcus was genuinely happy for her growth, even though it made him realize how much of their marriage had been built on incomplete understandings of who they both were. "Marcus, I need to tell you something," Clarissa said as their dinner wound down. "I've been dating someone. Nothing serious yet, but I wanted you to hear it from me." The news stung, but not as much as Marcus had expected. "Are you happy?" he asked. "I'm learning how to be happy," she replied. "I'm learning how to be in a relationship where both people share their real feelings instead of performing idealized versions of themselves." Marcus understood that she was describing what their marriage had lacked: authentic emotional intimacy rather than the careful dance of mutual caretaking they'd performed for 15 years. Clarissa, I need to apologize to you properly, not just for the deception, but for never learning how to be a real husband instead of just a successful one. She reached across the table and took his hand briefly. Marcus, I forgive you for the test, but more importantly, I forgive myself for staying in a marriage where I was never fully honest about what I needed. As Marcus drove home that night, he realized that the most important lesson from his elaborate deception wasn't about other people's capacity for love. It was about his own capacity for growth. The people he'd tested had been loving him, as well as they knew how, within the constraints of relationships he'd designed to protect himself from real intimacy. Now, at 64, he was finally learning what love actually looked like. Imperfect, complicated, sometimes inconvenient, always requiring vulnerability from both parties. It wasn't the worship he'd once demanded, nor the conditional transaction he'd feared. It was the messy, beautiful reality of humans choosing to care for each other, despite their limitations and fears. Marcus still had billions of dollars, but he'd learned to live as if he didn't. He still owned a company, but he'd learned to let other people run it. He still had a family, but he was learning to be part of it rather than just its financial center. The test was over, but the real work of loving and being loved was just beginning. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Wellington was wealthy enough to afford it.